They paid just $400 for a frozen camper abandoned in a Montana snowbank, thinking they'd finally take that retirement road trip they'd dreamed about for 40 years. But when Harold and Ruth Bennett pried open the ice-crusted door, what they found hidden beneath the rotting floorboards wasn't camping gear or old maps. It was a secret worth $215 million that would transform their final years, resurrect a dying town, and prove that sometimes the greatest adventures begin when life seems nearly over. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The January wind cut through Timber Ridge, Montana like a blade forged in the Arctic, sharp enough to make even the hardiest souls think twice about stepping outside. Population 873. Though that number had been dropping steadily for the past decade like water through cupped hands. Main Street consisted of exactly 5 buildings that mattered. Betty's Diner, with its perpetually flickering neon sign, Morrison Hardware, where the wood floors creaked with a century of footsteps, the post office that doubled as the town's gossip central, Miller's General Store where everyone gathered to complain about the weather and reminisce about better days, and the First Baptist Church that had seen more funerals than weddings in recent years. This was the kind of town people left, not the kind they moved to. The kind of place where dreams came to retire and slowly fade away. Harold Bennett stood at the frost-covered window of their small rental house on Maple Street, watching the snow accumulate on the hood of their aging Buick LeSabre. The car was a 1998 model with 230,000 miles on it. Rust creeping along the wheel wells like a slow-growing cancer. But it still ran. Mostly 72 years old. Harold cut a lean figure, worn down by time and labor, like a river stone. His hands were gnarled from a lifetime of construction work, knuckles swollen with arthritis that made mornings particularly painful. His back reminded him daily of every beam he'd ever lifted, every roof he'd ever shingled, every foundation he'd ever poured. Deep lines etched his face like a roadmap of hard years and harder choices. His flannel shirt, purchased from the clearance rack at Miller's 3 years ago, hung a bit looser than it used to. His jeans were held up by a worn leather belt cinched 2 notches tighter than last year. Weight loss wasn't intentional. It was just what happened when you stretched meals as far as they could go. Behind him, Ruth moved through their tiny kitchen with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned to make do with less, and then learned to make do with even less than that. At 70 years old, she still had that brightness in her eyes, though anyone looking closely would notice her hands trembled slightly when she thought no one was watching. The arthritis had been getting worse, particularly in her fingers. Some mornings she couldn't open jars or button her own cardigan. She wore 3 layers even inside because they kept the thermostat at 62 degrees to save on heating oil. Their breath was visible in the morning until the space heater in the living room finally took the edge off the cold. She moved between the ancient refrigerator and the equally ancient stove, preparing their breakfast. 2 eggs, split between them, 2 pieces of toast, black coffee because milk was expensive and cream was a luxury they couldn't remember. Her slippers were held together with duct tape on the soles, but they were warm, and that's what mattered. "Coffee's ready," she called softly, her voice carrying that musical quality it had always had, even when the words were weighed down with worry. Harold turned from the window and smiled. The kind of smile that had kept them together through 51 years of marriage. 3 kids raised on hope and determination, 2 layoffs that had nearly broken them, and 1 bout with breast cancer that had nearly taken her 10 years ago. It was a smile that said, "We're still here. We're still together. That's enough." even when it wasn't quite enough. "You're a saint," he said, settling into his chair at the small Formica table. The table had been salvaged from a yard sale in 1989. Its surface scarred with decades of use by previous owners, and then by them. The kitchen was cramped, barely enough room for two people to move past each other. The appliances were harvest gold, a color that had gone out of style before their youngest daughter was born. The linoleum was cracked in places, peeling up near the doorway where everyone's footsteps had worn it down to the subflooring. But it was home. Or at least, it was where they lived. There was a difference. Ruth sat across from him, cradling her mug with both hands, seeking the warmth that her body no longer seemed to generate on its own. Steam rose between them like a curtain they'd learned to see through after all these years. A curtain woven from shared struggles and quiet disappointments, and the stubborn refusal to give up on each other, even when giving up on everything else seemed like the only logical choice. "Did you see the notice?" she asked quietly, her eyes flicking toward a letter on the counter. The envelope had been opened 2 days ago, but neither of them had talked about it yet, as if ignoring it might make it go away. Harold's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He'd seen it. Of course, he'd seen it. Rent increase, effective March 1st, $50 a month. It might as well have been $500. "We'll figure it out," he said, though they both knew the math didn't work. They'd already cut everything they could possibly cut. No cable television, no internet, one car between them that they drove only when absolutely necessary. Meals stretched and reheated and stretched again until flavor became an afterthought. And nutrition was measured in survival rather than health. Their medications came from Canada because American prices would have meant choosing between pills and rent. They'd already made that choice once, and Ruth had ended up in the emergency room. Ruth looked down into her coffee like she might find answers in the dark liquid, swirling patterns that might reveal some path forward they hadn't yet seen. "Remember when we used to talk about buying an RV?" she whispered, her voice so soft he almost didn't hear it over the rattle of the space heater. "Driving out to see the redwoods, the Grand Canyon, the ocean. You wanted to see the Pacific. I wanted to feel sand under my feet." Her eyes misted over with the memory of younger versions of themselves, people who still believed in someday. Harold reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused thumb rubbing gentle circles on her papery skin. Her wedding ring, a simple gold band that had cost him 2 weeks' salary back in 1972, was now loose on her finger. She'd lost weight, too. They both had. "I remember," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I remember every dream we ever had, Ruthie. Every single one." They sat like that for a while, two people who'd worked their entire lives and followed every rule and done everything they were supposed to do. They'd raised 3 children who turned out well, good people with families of their own. Sarah lived in Seattle with her husband and 2 kids. Michael was in Denver, doing something with computers they didn't quite understand. Jennifer had moved to Atlanta for a job opportunity 5 years ago. They all called on Sundays, dutiful and loving, but their lives had moved on to different time zones, different worlds. The grandchildren knew them mostly through video calls and Christmas cards. There wasn't money for plane tickets. There wasn't money for much of anything beyond surviving until the next Social Security check arrived on the 3rd of every month. Harold and Ruth sat at that scarred Formica table with nothing but each other, and a stack of bills that never seemed to stop growing, looking at 72 and 70 years of life, and wondering how they'd ended up here, in this cold rental house, counting pennies, measuring coffee grounds, and watching their dreams fade like old photographs in sunlight. That afternoon, Harold drove Ruth to Miller's General Store for their weekly shopping trip. They had $37.50 to spend. Their budget, after paying the electric bill and putting gas in the car. This amount had to cover groceries, toiletries, anything they needed until the next check. They'd become experts at this grim mathematics. This game of survival played in the fluorescent-lit aisles of a small-town grocery store. They moved through the store with practiced precision, a choreographed dance they'd perfected over years of scarcity. Ruth held a small notepad where she'd written their list in careful handwriting. Harold pushed the cart, though they both knew they'd barely fill it. Store-brand pasta, marked-down bread from the day-old rack, eggs, the cheapest coffee available, canned vegetables on sale. They compared prices per ounce, did mental calculations, put things back when the numbers didn't work. No meat this week. They still had half a package of ground beef in the freezer from last month. No fresh fruit, except a small bag of apples, $3.99. A luxury justified because Ruth's doctor had said she needed more fiber. At the checkout counter, Maggie Miller rang up their items with the kind of sympathetic efficiency that made Ruth's cheeks burn with quiet shame. Maggie was 65, still working because her own retirement savings had evaporated in the 2008 financial crisis. She understood struggle, but somehow that made it worse. Being pitied by someone in a similar situation felt like confirmation that this was just how life was now, how it would always be. "You folks see the estate sale notice?" Maggie asked, trying to fill the awkward silence as she scanned their meager purchases. Her voice was deliberately casual, overly bright. Old Edgar Finch's place, up on Mountain View Road, passed away last month. No family to speak of. County's selling off everything. Harold bagged their groceries methodically, his movements careful and deliberate. Each item had its place, organized to make carrying them easier on Ruth's arthritic hands. "Hadn't heard," he said non-committally. Edgar Finch. He'd known the name but never the man. A recluse who'd lived on the edge of town for decades. Rarely seen, never socializing. Just another lonely old person. In a town full of them. Maggie leaned in conspiratorially, her voice dropping like she was sharing classified information. "They got all kinds of stuff up there. Furniture from the 50s. Tools that probably still work. Boxes of who knows what. County just wants it gone so they can sell the property. But here's the interesting part." She paused for effect. "They got an old camper sitting in his back lot. Been there for years, maybe decades. Probably frozen solid by now, but they're letting it go for next to nothing. $400, can you believe it? For a whole camper." Ruth's hand stilled on the counter, her fingers pressed against the worn wood like she needed to steady herself. $400. The number echoed in her mind, impossible and tantalizing in equal measure. They had $83.12 in their checking account until next month's Social Security check arrived. $400 might as well have been $4 million. But something in her chest flickered to life. Something she thought had died years ago, buried under bills and disappointments and the grinding weight of poverty in old age. Hope, small and fragile, but undeniably there. "A camper," she heard herself say, her voice sounding strange to her own ears. Harold looked at her sharply, his eyebrows drawing together in concern or confusion or both. He knew that tone. That was her dreaming tone. And dreams were dangerous when you lived on the edge of financial collapse. Maggie nodded enthusiastically, warming to her subject. "Old one. mind you. Has to be from the 70s, maybe even older. Probably needs work. Probably needs a lot of work. Edgar wasn't exactly known for maintenance. But still, it's a whole camper for $400. If someone had the time and know-how to fix it up, could be something worth having. Could be a project, you know. Something to do. She rang up their last item. That'll be $36.73. They drove home in silence. Ruth staring out the window at the white landscape. Mountains rising in the distance like frozen waves. Endless sky, pressing down with that peculiar winter brightness that made everything look both beautiful and harsh. Harold gripped the wheel tighter than necessary, his knuckles white, knowing what she was thinking because he was thinking it too. A camper. An actual camper. The thing they dreamed about for 40 years. The vehicle that was supposed to carry them into retirement adventures, into golden years that turned out to be more rust than gold. When they pulled into their driveway, the small house looking even smaller, in the vast Montana landscape, Ruth finally spoke. Her voice was quiet but firm. The voice she used when she'd made up her mind about something. We could look at it. Ruth, we don't have $400. Harold turned off the engine and sat there, both hands still on the wheel, staring straight ahead. We have the savings bond, she said quietly, carefully, like she was defusing a bomb. The one from your mother. Harold's mother had died 6 years ago after a brief illness. She'd left them almost nothing. She'd had almost nothing to leave, except for one single $1,000 savings bond, with a handwritten note attached. For something special. Don't waste it on bills. Promise me. They'd tucked it away in a drawer, never cashing it, holding on to it like a talisman, like proof that someday, somehow, they might actually do something beyond surviving. It had become almost sacred. That bond. The last gift from a woman who'd worked as a seamstress her entire life and died with less than $200 in her bank account, but still wanted to give her son something that mattered. That's for emergencies, Harold said, but his voice lacked conviction. Everything felt like an emergency these days. The rent increase was an emergency. Ruth's medication was an emergency. The Buick's transmission was making concerning noises that would be an emergency soon enough. Ruth turned to him, and in the fading afternoon light filtering through dirty windows, he saw the woman he'd fallen in love with in 1973. She'd been 22, working as a waitress at a diner in Billings, and he'd been 24, just starting out in construction, both of them young and poor, and full of dreams that seemed achievable back then. She'd had wild dreams and unshakable faith that life could be an adventure, that working hard and being good people would be enough. 50 years later, she was still that woman, buried under layers of disappointment and financial stress, but still in there somewhere. Harold, she said softly, reaching over to touch his arm, her fingers cold even through his flannel shirt. We're 70 years old. 70. If not now, when? If not this, what are we saving it for? Another year of counting pennies, another winter of being cold, another decade of watching other people live while we just survive. He stared at her for a long moment, seeing not just who she was, but who they'd been, who they'd hoped to become. You want to buy a frozen camper, he said. And it wasn't quite a question. I want to buy a dream, she corrected, her eyes bright with tears or determination, or both. Even if it's a frozen one. Even if it doesn't work out. Even if we're crazy old fools. I want to try, Harold. One more time. I want to believe we still get to want things. The words hung in the cold air of the car, visible breath, impossible hope, and the weight of 51 years of marriage to someone who'd never given up on him even when he'd given up on himself. Harold felt something shift in his chest. Some locked door creaking open after years of being sealed shut. He started to smile. Slowly, the expression feeling strange on his face after months of worry and resignation. "You want to buy a frozen camper?" he repeated. But this time, he was smiling. Ruth smiled back, genuine and bright, and suddenly looking 10 years younger. "I want to buy a dream." The next morning, Harold called the county office handling Edgar Finch's estate. His fingers trembled slightly as he dialed, and he had to check the number twice. The woman who answered sounded young and bored, probably a clerk, counting down the hours until her shift ended. "County administration. How can I help you?" "Yes, ma'am. I'm calling about the Edgar Finch estate sale. I understand there's a camper available." He heard papers rustling. "Oh, yeah. The old RV in the back lot. You interested in that thing?" "Yes, ma'am. Potentially." My. The woman sounded genuinely surprised, like she'd been told to list it, but never expected anyone to actually inquire. "Okay. Well, fair warning, sir. That camper's been sitting there for at least 15 years. Probably longer. Edgar never mentioned it. Never used it as far as anyone knew. It's not in great shape. Windows are all frosted over, doors frozen shut. Might not even be salvageable. But county says it's got to go. So we're selling it as is. Where is? $400. Cash only. Can we come look at it?" "Sure, I guess." "Estate sale is this Saturday. Starts at 8 in the morning. Cash only. No returns, no warranties. You haul it away yourself. You understand?" "Yes, ma'am. We understand." Harold hung up and found Ruth already putting on her coat, moving with more energy than he'd seen in months. "Where are you going?" he asked, though he knew. "To the bank," she said simply, her voice steady with purpose. "To cash a bond." The drive to the bank took 10 minutes. The branch was small, just 3 tellers and a manager's office. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and your financial struggles weren't exactly secret. They filled out the paperwork, Ruth's hand shaking slightly as she signed her name. The teller, a young woman named Ashley who'd gone to school with their granddaughter, counted out the money twice. $1,000, she said, pushing the bills across the counter. "You folks? Doing something exciting?" Ruth carefully put the money in her purse, folding it inside her envelope. "Maybe," she said with a small smile. "We're going to try." They kept $600 back emergency reserves, Harold insisted, because they weren't completely crazy, and put $400 in cash in Harold's wallet. The bills felt heavy, significant, like they weighed more than mere paper should. This was Harold's mother's last gift, transformed into possibility, into maybe, into one more chance to be more than 2 old people waiting to die. By Saturday morning, they'd barely slept. Harold had tossed and turned all night, alternating between excitement and certainty that they were making a terrible mistake. $400 for a camper that probably didn't work, probably couldn't be fixed, probably would end up being just another disappointment in a lifetime of them. Ruth had been awake too, he could tell from her breathing. Both of them lying in the dark, with their own thoughts and their shared hope. The estate sale was already underway when they arrived. A handful of locals picking through boxes of tools and furniture and the accumulated detritus of a lonely life. Edgar Finch's property sat on 5 acres at the edge of town. His house, a weathered craftsman with a sagging porch and boarded windows. The yard was overgrown. The driveway cracked and uneven. Everything speaking of years of benign neglect. A few pickup trucks were parked haphazardly around the property. People loading up old furniture and hand tools. The everyday archaeology of a life ended. But Harold and Ruth weren't interested in the house or the furniture or any of it. They walked around back, following a trampled snow path past an old shed and a rusted tractor, their breath visible in the cold morning air. And there it sat. The camper was older than they'd expected. A 1978 Wilderness model, with rounded edges and an aluminum shell that had oxidized to a dull gray, like pewter, left too long in the rain. It was bigger than Harold had imagined. Maybe 22 feet long. Substantial. Snow had piled against one side, drifted nearly to the windows. The door hung slightly ajar, frozen in place, creating a gap just wide enough to see darkness inside. Icicles dripped from the awning like crystalline tears, catching the morning light. The tires were completely flat, rubber cracked and disintegrating. One window had a crack, running diagonally across it. The whole thing tilted slightly to one side, like a tired old animal settling down for a final rest. It looked forgotten, abandoned, possibly beyond any hope of repair. A foolish purchase, a waste of precious money, everything their practical minds told them it would be. "Oh my," Ruth whispered. But she was smiling. That smile that said she saw past the rust and decay to what it could be, what it represented. Harold circled it slowly, his contractor's eye automatically assessing the damage, even as his heart whispered that they should walk away. Be sensible. Keep the $400 for something practical. Frame. Looks solid, he muttered, running his hand along the undercarriage. That's aluminum, not fiberglass. Built better than modern ones. Tires are shot, obviously. Wheel bearings probably seized. Can't see inside with all that frost on the windows. He peered through the gap in the door, but it was too dark to make out details. They stood there for several minutes, just looking, just imagining. Two elderly people in worn winter coats, staring at a frozen relic, seeing something no one else could see, seeing possibility, seeing adventure, seeing the road trip they'd promised themselves for 40 years. Finally, Harold pulled out his wallet with hands that shook slightly. "Let's do it," he said quietly, "before I come to my senses." They walked to the card table, where the county representative sat shivering under a portable space heater. A middle-aged woman in a county parks department jacket filling out forms in triplicate. "We'll take the camper," Harold said, his voice firmer than he felt. The woman barely looked up from her paperwork, like this was just another item on an inventory list. "The RV? 400. As is. Where is? You're responsible for moving it. Got something to haul it with. We'll figure it out," Harold said, and counted out the bills. $20 bills, his mother's final gift, laid out one by one until $400 sat on the table. The woman counted it again, made a notation on her clipboard, and wrote them a receipt on a carbonless form. She handed over a single key on a plastic tag, the kind you'd get at a hardware store. "Good luck with it," she said, in a tone that clearly communicated they were going to need it. More than luck. Maybe a miracle. Back at the camper, Ruth stood with her hand on the frozen door handle, her gloved fingers resting on metal so cold it seemed to burn. "Ready?" Harold asked. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Together, they pulled. The door groaned in protest, ice cracking along the seams. They pulled harder, putting their weight into it, and suddenly it gave way with a sharp crack like breaking bones. The door swung open, and cold air rushed out, carrying the smell of age and abandonment and something else, something almost preserved, like opening a tomb. They stepped inside carefully, Harold first, testing the floor to make sure it would hold their weight. The interior was dim, weak winter light, filtering through frost-covered windows like they were underwater, like they'd entered some forgotten submarine. Everything was frozen in time, literally. A thin layer of ice coated the countertops, glittering in the half-light. The small dinette table was still set with a coffee mug and a plate, both frozen solid, frost crystals growing on their surfaces like strange flowers. Upper cabinets hung open, revealing canned goods covered in frost, their labels faded and illegible. "Looks like someone just walked away," Ruth said softly, her breath visible in the frigid air. "Like they set down their breakfast and stepped outside and never came back." Harold moved deeper into the space, his boots crunching on frost that had formed on the linoleum floor. He checked the framework, running his hands along the walls, testing for rot or structural damage. Solid. He checked the ceiling for water stains. "Nothing. No water damage I can see," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the enclosed space. "That's remarkable, actually. Structure's sound. Better than I expected." He moved toward the back, where a small sleeping area was separated by a partial wall. Two narrow beds, still made with blankets stiff with ice. A small closet with the door hanging open. And then he paused, his contractor's eye catching something off. "That's strange," he said, frowning. "What?" Ruth asked, moving to his side, both of them crowding into the small space. Harold pointed to the floor near the back, just in front of the sleeping area. "These floorboards. See? They don't match." He was right. The wood was different, newer looking despite the frost. Different grain pattern, different width, and the spacing's off, like someone replaced them but didn't match the original exactly. He knelt down slowly, his knees protesting with audible cracks. Ruth winced sympathetically but said nothing. Harold ran his hand along the seam, where the mismatched boards met the rest of the floor. His fingers found the edge, traced it, and they're not nailed down properly. "Feel this," he pressed, and the board moved slightly. "They're just sitting here, like they're meant to be lifted." Ruth's heart began to pound. For reasons she couldn't explain, couldn't name. Something about the deliberateness of it, the intentionality. This wasn't shoddy work or repair. This was design, purpose. "What do you think is under there?" she whispered. Harold looked up at her, his weathered face full of questions. She saw her own confused excitement reflected in his eyes. Two people who'd bought a frozen camper on a desperate whim, now kneeling on an icy floor, confronting the possibility that they'd stumbled into something beyond a simple purchase. She nodded. Just once. Permission. Confirmation. Whatever was under there, they'd face it together. Harold's fingers found purchase on the edge of one board. He lifted carefully. The board came up easily, too easily, revealing darkness beneath. The smell of old air, sealed air, rushed up. He lifted another board, then another, his movements becoming more urgent as the hidden compartment revealed itself. Ruth knelt beside him, both of them now hovering over the opening. Harold's flashlight, the one he always carried, a habit from decades of construction work, clicking on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating what lay hidden in the camper's belly, secret and waiting, and completely impossible. They both gasped, the sound sharp and simultaneous in the frozen air. It wasn't spare parts. It wasn't camping supplies or forgotten tools or mouse nests or any of the things you'd expect to find in an abandoned camper. Arranged with meticulous care in a space that had been professionally constructed, lined with some kind of moisture-resistant material, sealed and protected, were things that didn't belong here. Things that didn't belong in rural Montana. In a frozen camper. In the life of two elderly people who counted pennies and stretched meals and wondered how to pay rent. Paintings, small but exquisite, wrapped in protective cloth and plastic, their frames just visible at the edges. Leather portfolios, the expensive kind, stuffed with papers. A metal box with a sophisticated lock that looked more suited to a bank vault than an RV. And everywhere, catching the light, the gleam of something valuable, something important, something purposefully hidden. Harold's hand shook as he reached for the nearest item. A small package wrapped in what looked like archival cloth. He carefully, reverently, pulled back the protective covering. Even in the dim light filtering through frosted windows, even in the impossible cold, even in the surreal moment of discovery, the image was breathtaking. A landscape, mountains and sky, painted with confident brushstrokes, rich colors somehow preserved perfectly. And there, in the corner, a signature, a name that made Ruth's breath catch in her throat. A name she recognized from coffee table books and public television documentaries. A name that belonged in museums, not in a frozen camper in Montana. Harold, Ruth whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of their own disbelieving breaths. Is that real? Is that what I think it is? He couldn't speak. Could only stare at the signature, at the painting, at the impossible truth hidden beneath the floor of a $400 camper. His hands trembled, and for a moment he thought he might drop it, might damage something irreplaceable, might wake up from whatever dream they'd stumbled into. Their retirement road trip, their desperate gamble on a frozen camper, their last attempt to grasp at something beyond mere survival, had just taken a turn they never could have imagined. Not in their wildest, most desperate dreams. Not in a lifetime of hoping for something more. They'd bought a dream for $400, but what they'd actually purchased, what they'd actually found, was something far more extraordinary, far more terrifying, and far more valuable than either of them could begin to process. The frozen Montana morning pressed against the walls of the camper. Somewhere outside, people continued to pick through an estate sale, loading furniture and tools into pickup trucks, going about their normal Saturday routines. But inside this small, cold space, Harold and Ruth Bennett knelt on an icy floor, staring at a hidden compartment full of impossibilities, their old hearts pounding with fear and wonder, and the dawning realization that their lives had just irrevocably changed. Harold's hands trembled as he set the small painting carefully on the frozen counter, as if it might shatter like ice if handled roughly. Ruth stood beside him, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other gripping his arm so tightly he could feel her fingers through 2 layers of clothing. Neither of them moved for several seconds, just breathing, just trying to process what they were seeing, what it might mean, what impossible situation they'd stumbled into. "We should put it back," Harold finally said, though he made no move to do so. His voice sounded strange in the frozen camper, hollow and uncertain. "We should call someone." "Who?" Ruth whispered, her breath fogging in the cold air. "Who do we call about something like this?" "I don't know. The police? The county? Maybe that woman with the clipboard?" Harold's mind raced through possibilities, each one seeming more absurd than the last. They looked at each other. 2 people who'd followed every rule their entire lives, who'd never even gotten a speeding ticket, who paid their taxes on time, and returned extra change when cashiers miscounted. And now they were suddenly standing in a camper they legally owned, staring at something that felt both like a miracle and a crime, holding what might be what certainly looked like a genuine piece of valuable art. Harold knelt again, slower this time, his knees protesting with sharp pains he tried to ignore. He carefully examined the hidden compartment with his flashlight, noting every detail with his contractor's precision. It was deep, maybe 2 feet down, professionally constructed with what looked like marine-grade plywood. The interior was lined with some kind of moisture-resistant material, possibly the same stuff used in boat hulls. This wasn't a hastily built hiding spot. This wasn't amateur work. Someone had engineered this with precision and purpose. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing and why. He pulled out another package, then another, his movements deliberate and careful. 5 paintings total, each wrapped with the same meticulous care. Different sizes, but all small enough to fit in the compartment. Each one protected in archival cloth, then wrapped in plastic, then cushioned with foam. Whoever had hidden these had taken extraordinary measures to preserve them. 3 leather portfolios came next. The kind attorneys carried to important meetings. The kind that cost hundreds of dollars each. They were heavy, substantial, and when Harold opened the first one with trembling fingers, he saw why. Documents. Dozens of them, each one protected in its own plastic sleeve, like precious artifacts in a museum archive. Ruth picked up one of the portfolios with shaking hands and carefully opened it, afraid to breathe too hard, afraid to damage something that looked so official, so important. Inside were papers, documents with ornate borders and official seals, the kind of paper that felt expensive even through the plastic protecting it. Stock certificates, she breathed, reading the letterhead with difficulty in the dim light. Her reading glasses were back at home on the kitchen table. Harold, these have dates from the 1930s. Look at this one, 1937. He moved beside her, reading over her shoulder. The certificates were beautifully printed, elaborate scroll work around the edges. Company names he vaguely recognized from history classes decades ago. Railroad companies, steel manufacturers, banks. Some of the companies he'd heard of, though he knew they'd been absorbed into larger corporations over the years. Others were completely unfamiliar. But the numbers made his head spin. Face values in the thousands, some in the tens of thousands. One certificate, yellowed with age but perfectly preserved in its plastic sleeve, claimed to represent 10,000 shares of something called American Steel and Iron, issued in 1939. These can't be real, Harold muttered, his voice lacking conviction even as he said it. They can't still be valid. That's not how it works. But even as he spoke, he knew he had no idea how it actually worked. He was a construction worker, not a financial expert. For all he knew, these could be worth fortunes, or they could be worthless antiques. But the documents looked authentic, official, preserved with the same obsessive care as everything else in the compartment. This wasn't the work of a con artist or a dreamer. This was something else entirely. They worked in silent awe for the next hour, neither of them even noticing the cold anymore, adrenaline and shock warming them from the inside. They carefully documented everything they found. Harold, using an old disposable camera he kept in the Buick's glove compartment for insurance purposes. 5 paintings, all appearing to be originals, all signed by names they vaguely recognized from museums and coffee table books Ruth had checked out from the library over the years. 37 bearer bonds from various decades, some from the 1920s, others from the 50s and 60s. Stock certificates from companies both familiar and obscure, dated anywhere from 1932 to 1976, and documents. So many documents. Letters on official letterhead, bills of sale with notary seals, certificates of authenticity that looked like they'd been issued by museums and galleries, all organized in protective sleeves like someone had maintained a careful archive. Everything was labeled, dated, cross-referenced. This wasn't random hoarding. This was systematic preservation. At the very bottom of the compartment, beneath everything else, Harold found a sealed envelope. Unlike the other documents, this one was yellowed with age, but not protected in plastic. It sat alone, like it had been placed there last, like it was meant to be found first, or last, or whenever someone finally looked. His fingers fumbled with the seal, partly from cold, partly from the trembling he couldn't seem to stop. Inside was a single page, handwritten in careful script, the kind of penmanship they didn't teach anymore. Each letter formed with deliberate precision. Ruth leaned close as Harold read aloud, his voice rough with emotion. To whoever finds this, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and this collection has found a new guardian. I cannot explain all my reasons for hiding these treasures, and I suspect my explanations would satisfy no one, least of all myself. Some pieces were inherited from my parents, who were themselves collectors of modest means but impeccable taste. Others I acquired over a lifetime of careful saving and fortunate timing, bought in years when no one else seemed to care about art or history or beauty. Harold paused, his throat tight. Ruth squeezed his arm, urging him to continue. All of these items have become a burden I can no longer carry. The world became too complicated, too dangerous for an old man with valuable things and no one to protect them, no one to leave them to, no one who would understand why I chose preservation over profit. I have no heirs, no family to entrust with this responsibility. My parents died decades ago. I never married. I have no siblings, no children, no one who would remember my name a year after I'm gone. Perhaps that makes me a coward for not finding a proper home for these pieces while I still could. But I grew too tired, too suspicious, too afraid of lawyers and institutions, and people who would see only dollar signs instead of beauty. Ruth's eyes filled with tears, recognizing the loneliness in those words, the resignation. These items represent more than monetary value. Though I know that value is substantial, they represent history, human achievement, moments of creation that transcend their creators. They deserve to be seen, to be preserved, to matter. I leave them to chance, to fate, to whoever is brave enough or desperate enough to look beneath the surface. Do with them what you will, but know that each piece has a story, has meaning beyond its price at auction. May they bring you more peace than they brought me. May you have the courage I lacked to let them matter to the world again. The letter was unsigned, but Harold and Ruth knew who'd written it. Edgar Finch, the recluse who'd lived on the edge of town for decades, who'd never married, never had visitors, who died alone with secrets frozen in an old camper in his backyard. A man so lonely, so isolated, that he'd chosen to entrust his life's collection to random chance, rather than watch it be fought over or divided or sold off piece by piece to pay estate taxes. Ruth sank onto the built-in bench, her legs suddenly weak, the cold finally penetrating through her coat. "Harold," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "what do we do?" He sat beside her heavily, the letter still in his hands, surrounded by wrapped paintings and portfolios, full of documents that might be worth thousands, or might be worth millions, or might be elaborate fakes that would make them look like fools. I don't know, Ruthie. I honestly don't know. They sat in silence for a long time, the winter cold seeping through their coats despite their shock-induced adrenaline, their breath fogging in the frozen air. Around them, wrapped in cloth and plastic and decades of secrecy, lay what might be the answer to every financial worry they'd ever had. Or it might be nothing. Elaborate fakes, a dead man's delusion, worthless paper, and painted canvas. But Harold's hands, calloused from decades of construction work, knew quality when they felt it. The frames were solid, expensive hardwood. The paper stock of the bonds was thick, substantial, official. The portfolios were genuine leather, not imitation. This wasn't the work of an amateur or a con artist. This was real. Whatever real meant in this context. Finally, Ruth spoke, her voice steadier than her hands. We need to know for certain, before we tell anyone else, before we make any decisions, before we do anything, we need to know what we actually have. If it's real or fake, if it's valuable or worthless, if we're sitting on a fortune or a fantasy. Harold nodded slowly, his practical mind reasserting itself through the fog of shock. We need an expert, someone who knows about art, about old documents, about authentication, but quietly. If this is real, if any of this is actually valuable. He didn't finish the sentence. They both understood. If word got out before they knew what they had, before they had legal counsel, before they understood their rights and obligations, they could lose everything, or worse, become targets. We should move it, Ruth said suddenly, decisively. Move the camper to our place. Tonight, before anyone notices, before anyone asks questions, get it off Edgar's property and onto ours, where we can control who sees it. Harold looked at her with renewed appreciation. After 51 years of marriage, she could still surprise him with her clarity in moments of crisis. You're right. Absolutely right. I'll call Dennis, see if I can borrow his trailer. Tell him we need to move some equipment. They gathered everything carefully, rewrapping each item exactly as they'd found it, placing the floorboards back in position with shaking hands. From the outside, the camper looked exactly as it had that morning. A frozen relic that two elderly people had inexplicably purchased for $400. Nothing to see, nothing to notice. Just another questionable purchase by people too old to know better. That evening, after the estate sale had closed and the other buyers had left with their boxes of tools and furniture, Harold returned with Dennis Cooper, a friend of 40 years who ran a small towing business. Dennis, who'd known Harold since they'd worked construction together in the 80s, helped him hook up the camper to a borrowed trailer without asking too many questions. Dennis was good that way. Got yourself a project, huh? Dennis said, circling the old camper with an appraising eye. This thing's from the 70s at least. Gonna take some work to get roadworthy. Gives me something to do, Harold replied, keeping his voice casual despite his racing heart. Ruthie's always wanted to take a road trip. Figured I'd surprise her. Dennis grinned. You're a good man, Harry. Linda would never let me spend $400 on something like this without 3 weeks of negotiations and a written contract. He helped Harold secure the camper to the trailer with practiced efficiency. You need help getting it set up at your place? Nah, I got it. Thanks, Dennis. I owe you. Buy me a beer sometime. That's payment enough. By 9 o'clock that night, the camper sat in Harold and Ruth's small backyard, covered with a tarp Harold had bought at Morrison Hardware on the way home, looking like nothing more interesting than an old man's questionable project. Neighbors who noticed, if any did, would just see what they expected to see Harold Bennett working on another repair job, probably trying to make a few extra dollars to supplement his Social Security. Inside their house, Ruth sat at their kitchen table with her ancient laptop, the one their daughter Sarah had sent them 3 Christmases ago when she'd upgraded her own. Ruth had never been good with computers, had resisted learning for years. But desperation made her determined. She typed carefully, one finger at a time, squinting at the screen. Art appraisers near me. Harold stood behind her, reading over her shoulder, still wearing his coat because they'd turned the heat down while they were gone, and the house hadn't warmed up yet. Most of the search results were for insurance appraisers or antique dealers, people who valued furniture and jewelry, not fine art. Nothing that felt right. Nothing that inspired confidence. For something this potentially significant, this potentially dangerous. Then Ruth found something different, buried on the 3rd page of results, where she'd almost given up looking. A name that appeared in several articles about art authentication and provenance research, always quoted as an expert, always described with impressive credentials. She clicked on the link, squinting at the small text, her reading glasses sliding down her nose. Dr. Margaret Castellano, she read slowly, pronouncing each syllable carefully. Expert in provenance research and artwork authentication, specializing in American art from 1850 to 1950. Based in Helena. She looked up at Harold, her eyes bright with something between hope and fear. That's only 2 hours away. Harold leaned closer, reading the website. Dr. Castellano had impressive credentials, PhD in art history from Columbia, former curator at 2 major museums, published author, consultant to auction houses, and private collectors. Her website showed a professional office, testimonials from satisfied clients, and a phone number. A real person, not some internet scam, not someone who'd disappear with their treasures. Should we call her? Ruth whispered, as if speaking too loudly might make the decision more real, more irrevocable. Harold looked at his wife. This woman who'd worked as a grocery store cashier for 30 years, who'd raised 3 children on their combined working-class income, who'd never complained when they couldn't afford vacations or new furniture, or the comfortable retirement they'd promised themselves. She deserved more than this cold rental house and $50 rent increases. She deserved to know if their desperate $400 gamble had been genius or folly. We should, he said firmly. Monday morning. First thing. They spent the weekend in a strange state of suspended animation, going through the motions of their normal life, while their minds spun with possibilities and fears. Saturday night, Ruth made spaghetti with the marked-down ground beef they'd bought, and they ate in near silence, both of them thinking about what lay hidden in their backyard, under a tarp. Sunday, they went to church like they did every week, sitting in their usual pew, singing the familiar hymns, listening to Pastor Williams talk about trusting in God's plan. Harold wondered if God's plan included old campers and hidden paintings, and the possibility that everything could change. After service, they smiled and made small talk with neighbors who had no idea what was sitting in their backyard. What impossible choice they were facing. Sunday night. Neither of them slept. Harold lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, listening to Ruth's breathing, and knowing she was awake too. What if it's all fake? She whispered in the darkness. Then we've got an interesting story and a $400 camper, he replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "What if it's real? Then everything changes," he said simply, and reached for her hand. They lay like that for hours, fingers intertwined. Two people on the edge of something they couldn't yet name, couldn't yet believe, but couldn't ignore. Monday morning arrived with agonizing slowness. Harold waited until exactly 9 o'clock, not too early to seem desperate, not too late to seem casual, before dialing the number on Dr. Castellano's website. His hands shook slightly as he pressed the buttons. The phone rang twice before a professional female voice answered. "Castellano Art Consultation. This is Maria speaking. How may I help you?" "Castellano." Harold cleared his throat, suddenly unsure of what to say, how to explain. He'd rehearsed this conversation a dozen times, but now all his prepared words evaporated. "Yes, ma'am. My name is Harold Bennett. I'd like to speak with Dr. Castellano about appraising some artwork." "Is this for insurance purposes, sir?" The secretary's voice was polite but efficient, like she handled these calls routinely. "No. It's—" Harold hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It's for authentication. I recently acquired some pieces and I'd like to verify their origin and their value." The secretary's tone shifted slightly, becoming more engaged, more interested. "I see. What type of pieces are we discussing, Mr. Bennett?" Harold looked at Ruth, who nodded encouragingly from across their small kitchen. "Small paintings," he said carefully, keeping his voice steady. "Possibly from the early 20th century, and some historical documents, bearer bonds, stock certificates, that kind of thing." There was a pause, the sound of papers being shuffled. "And you're calling from where, sir?" "Timber Ridge, Montana." Another pause, longer this time. Harold could hear typing, probably checking a calendar or computer system. "Mr. Bennett, Dr. Castellano typically doesn't travel for initial appraisals. However, she does have a gap in her schedule this Thursday. If you could bring photographs and any documentation you have to her office in Helena, she could meet with you." Would 2 o'clock work? Harold's heart hammered so hard he was certain the secretary could hear it through the phone. Yes, that would work perfectly." "Excellent. I'll need your contact information for our records." Harold provided their address, phone number, and email address. Sarah had set up an email account for them years ago that they rarely used. "And Mr. Bennett, Dr. Castellano will need to see high-quality photographs of the pieces. If possible, the clearer, the better. Can you manage that?" "Yes, ma'am. We'll bring everything you need." When he hung up, Ruth was standing, her hands pressed together like she was praying. "Thursday, 2 o'clock. We're really doing this. We're really doing this," Harold confirmed. And for the first time since they'd pried open that frozen camper door, he felt something other than shock. He felt purpose. The next 3 days were the longest of their lives. Harold carefully photographed each painting, each document, trying to capture details without removing the protective coverings more than absolutely necessary. He worked in their small living room, the only space with decent natural light, arranging items on their coffee table and shooting from multiple angles. Ruth organized everything they knew about Edgar Finch, which wasn't much. She went to the library and used their internet connection, faster than their home dial-up, to search for information. What she found was sparse but intriguing. Edgar Finch had arrived in Timber Ridge in 1992, buying his property with cash. Before that, there was almost nothing, no social media presence, obviously, since he'd been elderly even then, but also no public records she could find, no military service, no marriage license, no business registrations. It was as if he'd appeared fully formed at age 60 or so, bought 5 acres on the edge of town, and proceeded to live there alone for over 30 years until his death at 93. The man had been a mystery even before they'd found his hidden collection. Now he was an enigma, wrapped in a puzzle, wrapped in millions of dollars of potentially valuable art. Wednesday night, neither Harold nor Ruth slept at all. They lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to each other's breathing, holding hands in the darkness. "What if she thinks we stole them?" Ruth whispered around 3 in the morning. "What if she calls the police?" "We didn't steal anything," Harold replied firmly. "We bought that camper legally, through a legitimate estate sale. We have a receipt. We have documentation. We've done nothing wrong. But what if someone claims they should have inherited these pieces? What if Edgar had family we don't know about? Then we'll deal with it. Together, like we always have." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "I'm scared, Harold." "Me too, Ruthie. Me too. Me." Thursday morning arrived bright and cold. Harold wore his only suit, the navy one purchased for their daughter Jennifer's wedding 15 years ago. It was a bit loose now he'd lost weight they couldn't afford to lose, but it was clean and pressed. Ruth wore her best dress, the navy blue one she saved for funerals and important occasions. They looked at themselves in the bathroom mirror. An elderly couple dressed too formally for a weekday morning, trying to look like people who belonged in a conversation about valuable art instead of what they were. 2 frightened, desperate people hoping for a miracle. The paintings and documents were packed in Harold's weathered briefcase, the one he'd used for contracting bids decades ago. The leather was cracked, the handle worn smooth, but it was all they had. They looked absurd, Harold thought, as they loaded into the Buick, 2 old people in formal clothes, driving through Montana in a car held together by hope and stubbornness, carrying what might be a fortune, or might be nothing. The drive to Helena took exactly 2 hours and 17 minutes. Neither of them spoke much, both lost in their own thoughts and fears. What if the paintings were fake? What if they were real? Which possibility was more terrifying? Harold wasn't sure anymore. Dr. Castellano's office was in a restored Victorian building in downtown Helena. All red brick and white trim, elegant but not ostentatious. The kind of building that whispered quality and expertise without shouting. They parked on the street, fed quarters into the meter with shaking hands, and walked to the entrance. The waiting room was warm and tastefully decorated with art prints and comfortable chairs. A young woman at the reception desk smiled at them. "Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, Dr. Castellano is expecting you. Please, have a seat. She'll be right with you." They sat, holding hands, not speaking, surrounded by art they could never afford to own, about to show an expert what they'd found in a frozen camper. Harold wondered if this was how lottery winners felt. That strange combination of hope and terror, the sense that your entire life was about to pivot on something completely beyond your control. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, a door opened, and a woman emerged. Dr. Margaret Castellano was younger than they'd expected, perhaps 50, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a neat bun and sharp, kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore slacks and a cardigan, not the formal suit they'd imagined. Somehow that made her more approachable, more real. "Mr. and Mrs. Bennett." She extended her hand, her grip firm and warm. "I'm Margaret Castellano. Thank you for coming. I have to say, I'm very intrigued by your call. It's not every day I get inquiries about early 20th century artwork from Timber Ridge." Her smile was genuine, curious, rather than condescending. "Thank you for seeing us, ma'am," Harold managed, his voice rough with nerves. "Please, call me Margaret. Let's go to my examination room. I'm eager to see what you've brought." The examination room was part laboratory, part art studio, with specialized lights mounted on adjustable arms, magnifying equipment on wheeled stands, and reference books lining every wall. A large table dominated the center of the space, covered with white cloth. The room smelled faintly of chemicals and old paper, professional and precise. Harold set the briefcase on the examination table and opened it with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. Dr. Castellano pulled on white cotton gloves and carefully removed the first painting. The landscape they'd discovered first. The one with the signature that had started all of this. For a long moment, she said nothing, just studied it, under the specialized lights, her face carefully neutral, professional. Harold and Ruth stood frozen, barely breathing, watching her examine their impossible discovery. She turned the painting over, studying the back of the canvas, the frame, the way it was constructed. She pulled out a magnifying glass and examined the signature, the brushwork, the craquelure, the fine network of cracks that form in old paint. Then she looked up at them, and her expression had changed. The professional neutrality was gone, replaced by something between shock and excitement. Carefully controlled, but definitely there. "Mr. and Mrs. Bennett," she said slowly, setting the painting down with extreme care. "Where did you get this?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications Harold didn't fully understand. "We bought a camper," Ruth said quietly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "From an estate sale. A man named Edgar Finch. He died last month. The camper was on his property. It was hidden inside. There are more." Dr. Castellano's eyes widened fractionally. "More paintings?" "More paintings. 4 more. And documents. Bonds, certificates, letters, all hidden under the floor in a sealed compartment." Harold's voice was gaining strength, the truth pouring out now. "We didn't know. We just wanted to buy a camper, maybe fix it up, take a trip. We never expected." He gestured helplessly at the painting. Dr. Castellano returned her attention to the artwork, examining it again with even more intensity. "Do you know what this is?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "We think it might be valuable," Harold ventured, understating what he actually thought, what he desperately hoped. She laughed. But it wasn't unkind. It was the laugh of someone confronted with something absurd and wonderful. "Valuable. Yes, this is valuable." She set it down with reverence and met their eyes. "If this is authentic, and I'll need to run several tests to confirm, but my initial assessment is very promising. This is an original work by a very significant American artist. We're talking museum quality. Mr. and Mrs. Bennett. The kind of piece that appears in textbooks and major exhibitions." Ruth's hand found Harold's and squeezed so hard it hurt. "The other paintings?" Harold asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Castellano examined each one with the same meticulous care, her excitement growing despite her professional demeanor. When she saw the documents, the bonds, the certificates, her face went pale. She sat down heavily in a chair and looked at them with something approaching awe. "Okay," she said, taking off her glasses and cleaning them with a cloth, a gesture Harold recognized as buying time to think. "Okay, I need you to tell me everything. Everything about where these came from, how you found them, what you know about Edgar Finch, what you know about provenance, ownership, anything and everything. And then I need to make some calls, Because if even half of this is authentic, if the provenance can be established. She paused, calculating, her mind clearly racing. We're looking at tens of millions of dollars. Possibly much more. The room seemed to tilt. Harold felt Ruth sway beside him and steadied her, though he wasn't certain who was supporting whom. Could be more? He managed to ask, his voice cracking. More than tens of millions? Dr. Castellano nodded slowly, her expression serious. Art market values fluctuate, and authentication takes time, and provenance research is crucial. But yes, based on what I'm seeing here, if these pieces are genuine, if the ownership chain can be established, if there are no legal complications, she met their eyes. You could be looking at a collection worth well over $100 million, possibly significantly more, depending on what the bearer bonds turn out to be worth. Some of these could have been accumulating interest for decades. Some might represent shares in companies that no longer exist or that became parts of major corporations. This isn't just art, Mr. and Mrs. Bennett. This is history, finance, and culture, all wrapped together. The world went very quiet. Somewhere in the building, a phone rang. Outside, traffic hummed past on Helena's streets. But in that room, two elderly people who'd struggled to pay rent, who'd stretched meals and worn second-hand clothes, and wondered if they'd have enough for heating oil, sat frozen in the realization that their lives had just irrevocably changed. Ruth began to cry. Not from joy or relief, but from the sheer, overwhelming weight of it all. Tears streamed down her weathered cheeks as decades of financial stress, of worry, of making do, of quietly suffering, came pouring out. Harold pulled her close, his own eyes wet, his body shaking. Dr. Castellano gave them privacy for several minutes, stepping out to presumably give them space to process, to break down, to begin accepting what they'd discovered. When she returned, she carried a box of tissues and 2 bottles of water, her professional demeanor softened by genuine compassion. "I know this is overwhelming," she said gently, handing Ruth the tissues. "I can't imagine what you're feeling right now, but I need to be very clear about what happens next. Because this is not going to be simple, and it's not going to be quick." Harold wiped his eyes and straightened his shoulders, trying to regain some composure. "What do you recommend? What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more." Dr. Castellano returned to her chair and leaned forward, her expression serious. "This requires extensive authentication. We'll need to verify each piece individually, carbon dating for the paintings, pigment analysis, canvas examination, comparison with known works from the artists in question. The documents will need separate verification paper analysis, ink dating, checking the serial numbers on the bonds against historical records, researching the provenance of each item." "How long?" Ruth asked, her voice steadier now. "Months. Maybe longer. This isn't something we can rush. Not with this much at stake." Dr. Castellano pulled out a notepad. "The bearer bonds especially will require investigation. Some may have been reported lost or stolen decades ago. Others may have been legitimately issued but never redeemed. We'll need to contact the institutions that issued them, trace ownership history, determine legal rights." "Are we in trouble?" Ruth whispered, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at both of them since they'd first opened that compartment. "Did we do something wrong?" Dr. Castellano shook her head firmly. Not if you proceed correctly. You acquired these items legally, through a legitimate estate sale. Edgar Finch's estate has been settled with no heirs. I can help you verify that. You've done nothing wrong. Number trade. In fact, you've done everything right by not attempting to sell these items immediately, by seeking expert guidance, by being transparent about your discovery. She stood and paced the room, thinking. But this level of discovery, it brings attention, scrutiny, complexity. There will be legal questions about ownership, tax implications, media attention. Once word gets out, this kind of find doesn't stay secret. Harold felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. What do you recommend we do? Specifically, Dr. Castellano stopped pacing and looked at them directly. I recommend you let me help you navigate this. I can assemble a team authentication experts for each type of item. Legal counsel experienced in estate law and found property cases. Financial advisors who understand the art market. Security professionals to protect the collection during evaluation. People you can trust. People who will work in your best interest. Not their own. Why would you help us? Harold asked, not suspiciously, but genuinely curious. What's in it for you? Wise 19. Wise 19. Wise 19. She smiled. Professionally? This is the kind of discovery that defines careers. I would want to be involved in the authentication process. With your permission, and I would document the findings for academic publication. But personally, her smile softened. I became an art historian because I believe art matters, that beauty and history and human achievement should be preserved and shared. What you've found, if it's authentic, represents a significant piece of American cultural history that was almost lost. I want to help make sure it's not lost again. Ruth and Harold exchanged glances, an entire conversation happening in that look. 5 decades of knowing each other, trusting each other, facing impossible situations together. What's the first step? Ruth asked. First, we secure the collection. It can't stay in your home or in that camper. Too risky. I know a climate-controlled vault here in Helena with excellent security. We'll transport everything there tomorrow, under guard. Second, I start making calls to assemble the team. Third, she paused. Third, you two go home and try to process what's happened, because your lives are about to change in ways you can't possibly imagine yet, and you'll need each other more than ever. They left her office 3 hours later with a plan, a team being assembled, and a security service being arranged to meet them in Timber Ridge the next morning. Harold and Ruth sat in their Buick in the parking lot as snow began to fall, watching the flakes drift against the windshield like a million tiny questions, each one asking what came next. We just walked in there with millions of dollars in a briefcase, Ruth said wonderingly, her voice almost dreamlike. We drove 2 hours with a fortune in our back seat, Harold added, shaking his head. We could have been robbed. We could have crashed. We could have. They looked at each other and started laughing. The kind of laughter that comes from shock and relief and the absolute absurdity of it all. 2 old people in an aging car, carrying impossible wealth, stumbling through a discovery that defied everything they knew about how life worked. On the drive home, they talked about what they'd always wanted to do. Not spend, just do. Visit their grandchildren without worrying about plane tickets. Fix Ruth's teeth, the ones she'd been putting off for 5 years. Pay off the Buick. Maybe, Harold said quietly. Take that road trip we always planned. Ruth smiled through fresh tears. In a better camper. though. Definitely in a better camper. But even as they planned and dreamed, both of them understood that something more profound than wealth had entered their lives. They'd been entrusted with something meaningful, something that had stories and history and value beyond money. Edgar Finch, in his lonely, careful way, had left them more than hidden treasures. He'd left them a responsibility, a purpose, a chance to matter in ways they'd never imagined. As the lights of Timber Ridge appeared in the distance, their small town glowing against the dark Montana landscape, Harold reached over and took Ruth's hand. "Everything's going to change," he said softly. "I know," Ruth replied. "I'm terrified." "Me too. But we're in this together, like always," she confirmed. They pulled into their driveway, their small rental house looking exactly as it had that morning, the camper still covered with its tarp in the backyard. Everything outwardly the same, while inwardly, fundamentally, everything had shifted. Inside, they made tea and sat at their scarred Formica table, the same table where they'd read the rent increase notice that had started all of this. Ruth picked up the phone and called their children. Not to tell them about the discovery, not yet. Not until they knew more, but just to hear their voices, to ground herself in what mattered most. Harold stood at the window, looking out at the camper in their backyard, thinking about Edgar Finch, about loneliness and secrets, and the strange ways life surprises you when you least expect it. They'd bought a frozen camper for $400, desperate for one last adventure. What they'd found was so much more than that, not just valuable items, but a second chance, a purpose, a reminder that even at 72 and 70, life could still astonish you. Tomorrow, the security team would arrive. The authentication would begin. Their quiet life would become complicated, public, changed forever. But tonight, they were still just Harold and Ruth, two people who'd loved each other through poverty and struggle, who'd bought a dream for $400 and discovered it was worth more than they could have imagined, not in money, but in meaning, in purpose, in the extraordinary possibility that sometimes, just sometimes, desperate gambles pay off in ways that transform not just your bank account, but your soul. The authentication process began with swift precision that left Harold and Ruth feeling swept along by forces they couldn't quite control. The morning after their meeting with Dr. Castellano, two black SUVs arrived in Timber Ridge before sunrise, pulling up to their small rental house while most of the town still slept. Professional security personnel, quiet and efficient, transferred every item from the camper to reinforced cases, documenting each piece with photographs and detailed inventories. Neighbors who happened to be awake probably thought Harold had finally gotten himself into some kind of trouble, but no one asked questions. Not yet. By noon, the collection was secured in a climate-controlled vault in Helena, protected by more security than Harold had ever seen outside of movies. Dr. Castellano had assembled her team with remarkable speed. 3 authentication specialists, a provenance researcher named David Chen who'd worked with the Smithsonian, a lawyer specializing in estate law and found property, and a financial advisor who handled high-value art acquisitions. They all treated Harold and Ruth with respectful professionalism, but Harold couldn't shake the feeling that they were projects now, not just people. Objects of fascination rather than individuals with agency. The first legal consultation took place in a conference room that felt too formal, too intimidating. All dark wood and leather chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Helena. Marcus Brennan, the attorney, was in his mid-50s with silver hair and the kind of suit that probably cost more than Harold had earned in some months during his working life. But his manner was surprisingly warm. and he spent the first 20 minutes just listening to their story without interruption. Legally, this is actually more straightforward than you might think, Marcus said once they'd finished. Edgar Finch's estate was settled through probate. He had no will, no heirs, no debt significant enough to complicate distribution. The county sold his assets at public auction to settle the estate and cover administrative costs. You purchase the camper legally, with documentation. Everything inside the camper legally transferred to you as part of that purchase. So we own it? Ruth asked, her voice small in the large room. All of it? Yes. Subject to one critical caveat. None of these items can have been reported stolen. If any piece was taken illegally at some point, rightful ownership would revert to whoever can prove prior claim. That's why the provenance research is crucial. Marcus pulled out several folders. David Chen is already working on that. He's tracing the history of each item, checking databases of stolen art, researching exhibition histories, contacting museums and galleries. It's painstaking work, but it's necessary. Harold felt his stomach clench. What if something was stolen? Even if Edgar didn't know, then you'd lose that particular piece, but not the others. Each item stands on its own legally. However, Marcus smiled slightly. Based on the preliminary research David's already done, everything looks legitimate. Edgar Finch appears to have been a very careful, very knowledgeable collector who acquired these pieces legally over decades. He just chose to hide them rather than display or sell them. Over the following weeks, the authentication process consumed their lives. They drove to Helena twice a week for meetings, watching as experts examined their discovery with tools and techniques Harold barely understood. Infrared imaging revealed underdrawings beneath painted surfaces. Pigment analysis confirmed that paints matched the historical periods. Canvas examination showed weaving patterns consistent with specific manufacturers from specific decades. Each test brought them closer to confirmation, and each confirmation brought them closer to a truth they still couldn't quite accept. The first piece to be definitively authenticated was the landscape painting, the one they'd found first, the one with the signature that had started everything. Dr. Castellano called them on a Tuesday afternoon, her voice vibrating with controlled excitement. It's authentic. Every test confirms it. This painting was created by the artist in question, dated to approximately 1912, and based on David's provenance research, it disappeared from a private collection in Boston in 1947 during an estate transfer. It was never reported stolen, simply lost in the chaos of inheritance disputes. Current estimated value, $4,300,000. Ruth made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Harold's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles went white. That's one painting, he managed to say. That's one painting, Dr. Castellano confirmed. We have 4 more to authenticate, and preliminary examinations suggest they're all genuine. Mr. Bennett, you and your wife have discovered something extraordinary. By the end of March, 3 months after that frozen morning when they'd pried open the camper door, the full scope of their discovery had been confirmed. 5 paintings, all authentic, collectively valued at $18,700,000. 37 bearer bonds, some dating back to the 1920s, which, after complex negotiations with the issuing institutions and historical research, were determined to be worth $93 million. Some having accumulated decades of compound interest, others representing shares in companies that had been absorbed into modern corporations. Stock certificates worth another $42 million. documents and letters of historical significance valued at $3 million more. The total, after authentication fees and legal costs, came to $156,400,000. The number was so large it stopped feeling real. It was just digits, abstract and meaningless, until Harold tried to imagine what it actually meant, and his mind simply couldn't process it. But keeping the discovery secret had become impossible. Word had leaked not from Dr. Castellano's team, who were bound by confidentiality agreements, but from somewhere in the bureaucracy. Maybe someone at the vault, maybe a clerk who'd processed paperwork, maybe just Montana's efficient small-town gossip network. By early April, the story had broken. Elderly Montana couple discover fortune in frozen camper, read the headline in the Helena Independent Record. From there, it spread like wildfire through social media, news aggregators, and cable news networks desperate for feel-good stories. $400 gamble pays off in millions. Hidden art collection found by retirees. Montana's frozen fortune. The phone calls started immediately. Reporters wanting interviews. Distant relatives Harold and Ruth had never heard of, suddenly remembering close family connections and unfortunate financial circumstances. Investment advisors with glossy presentations and promises of wealth management. Charitable organizations with compelling needs and aggressive fundraising tactics. Real estate agents suggesting they'd want to upgrade their living situation. Car dealerships offering complimentary test drives of luxury vehicles. It was overwhelming and exhausting and intrusive in ways they'd never anticipated. People they'd known for years suddenly looked at them differently, with a mixture of awe and envy and calculation. At Miller's General Store, Maggie could barely make eye contact, clearly feeling awkward about having mentioned the estate sale that had started all of this. At church, Pastor Williams gave a sermon about the corrupting influence of wealth that felt pointed despite his assurances that it was planned weeks earlier. Neighbors they'd never been close to suddenly found reasons to stop by, bringing casseroles and curiosity in equal measure. "They think we've changed," Ruth said one evening, sitting at their kitchen table in the same rental house, eating the same simple dinner they'd always eaten. "Like finding money transformed us into different people. Have we changed?" Harold asked, genuinely uncertain. Ruth thought about it. "I don't know. I still worry about money, even though I shouldn't. I still check prices at the grocery store. I still turn off lights when I leave a room. But," she paused, "I'm angry in a way I wasn't before. Angry that we struggled for so long. Angry that we had to choose between medication and food. Angry that the world is set up so that people like us work their entire lives and end up with nothing." Harold nodded slowly. "I know what you mean. It's like the wealth revealed how unfair everything was, instead of fixing it." The community's reaction was mixed and complex. Some people were genuinely happy for them, pleased that good fortune had found decent people who'd struggled for so long. Mrs. Henderson from the post office hugged Ruth and cried, saying it restored her faith that sometimes life rewarded hardship. Dennis Cooper, who'd helped move the camper, just grinned and said, "Well, I'll be damned. Good for you, Harry." But others were skeptical, suspicious, even hostile. At Betty's diner, Harold overheard a conversation he wasn't meant to hear. Convenient, isn't it? Suddenly they're millionaires. You ask me, something doesn't add up. Maybe they knew what was in that camper all along. Maybe they had some arrangement with Edgar Finch. He'd left without ordering, his appetite gone, his stomach churning with the unfairness of it. They hadn't done anything wrong. They'd bought a camper legally. They'd discovered something extraordinary by pure chance. But somehow that made them suspect, made them targets of resentment and conspiracy theories. The media attention intensified when the story reached national outlets. CNN ran a segment. Good Morning America wanted them for an interview. Publishers approached them about book deals. Movie producers inquired about rights to their story. It was surreal and suffocating, their private miracle becoming public entertainment. One night, after a particularly difficult day of fielding calls and questions and barely veiled accusations, Harold and Ruth sat on their small porch. Despite the lingering cold, the camper still sat in their backyard. Empty now, just a shell of metal and wood that had briefly held their future. "I don't know what to do," Harold admitted quietly. "Everyone wants something from us. Everyone has an opinion about what we should do with the money. And I don't know how to be this person, Ruthie. I don't know how to be someone with $150 million. Ruth took his hand, her fingers cold despite her gloves. "Then maybe we shouldn't be." He looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" "I mean maybe we don't keep it. Maybe we don't become those people." Her voice grew stronger, more certain. "We didn't earn this money, Harold. We found it. Edgar Finch left it to chance, to whoever was desperate enough or brave enough to look. And we looked. But that doesn't mean we have to keep all of it. Doesn't mean we have to become the kind of people who hoard wealth while others struggle." Harold felt something shift in his chest. A locked door creaking open. "You want to give it away, Cress. You want to give it away. I want to do what feels right," Ruth corrected. "And keeping $150 million while people in this town, people we know, people like we used to be, struggle to pay rent and buy medicine that doesn't feel right. That feels wrong." They sat in silence for a long time, watching stars emerge in the Montana sky, the same stars they'd watched their entire lives, but which somehow looked different now, brighter maybe, or just more significant. Finally, Harold spoke. "The paintings, they don't belong in a vault. They belong where people can see them, appreciate them, learn from them. Museums," Ruth agreed. "That's what Edgar Finch wanted, I think. He said they deserved to be seen, to be preserved, to matter. We could donate them to museums, make sure they're displayed, make sure his collection does what he hoped it would do. And the money from the bonds and certificates," Harold continued, the idea taking shape. "We could create something, not for us, but for others. Something that addresses what we know, what we lived through." Ruth's eyes brightened. "A foundation for elderly care. Right here in Timber Ridge." The words hung in the air between them, crystallizing into purpose. Harold found himself thinking about the past 3 decades, the struggles they'd endured, the indignities of poverty in old age. He remembered the year Ruth had needed a root canal but they couldn't afford it. So she'd lived with pain for 8 months until the tooth abscessed and had to be pulled. He remembered choosing between heating oil and groceries during particularly brutal winters. He remembered the shame of using food stamps at Miller's General Store, the way some people looked at them, the judgment in those glances. He remembered his friend Walter Simmons, who died 2 years ago at 78. Alone in his apartment, dead for 3 days before anyone found him. Walter had been a carpenter, a good man, a hard worker, but his social security hadn't been enough. His savings had evaporated during medical emergencies, and he died alone because poverty isolates, because being old and poor means being invisible. "I don't want anyone else to live like we did," Harold said, his voice rough with emotion. I don't want anyone else to choose between medicine and food. I don't want anyone else to die alone because they can't afford to matter. Ruth squeezed his hand. Then, let's make sure they don't. The next morning, they called Marcus Brennan and Dr. Castellano and asked them to come to Timber Ridge instead of making Harold and Ruth drive to Helena again. The team arrived that afternoon, clearly curious about this unscheduled meeting, probably worried that Harold and Ruth were having second thoughts or legal concerns. They met in Harold and Ruth's small living room, expensive professionals in their suits and professional attire, crowded into a space barely large enough for the old furniture. Harold served instant coffee in mismatched mugs. Ruth offered store-brand cookies on a chipped plate. The contrast between the setting and the wealth they were discussing felt surreal. "We've made a decision," Harold began, his voice steady despite his nerves, "about what to do with the collection." The room fell silent, everyone leaning forward. "We're donating 4 of the 5 paintings to museums," Ruth continued. "Institutions where they can be displayed, where the public can see them, where they'll be preserved and studied." Dr. Castellano's face lit up. "That's wonderful. Truly wonderful. Which museums were you thinking? We'd like your guidance on that," Harold said. "Places where they'll be appreciated, where Edgar Finch's collection will be honored, not just stored in some basement." "And the 5th painting?" Marcus asked. "We'll auction it," Harold said. "We need some liquidity for what we're planning next." He took a breath, glancing at Ruth, who nodded encouragingly. "We're establishing a foundation, the Bennett Foundation for Elder Care. We'll use the proceeds from the painting auction and the bulk of the money from the bonds and certificates to create an endowment. The foundation will fund a community center here in Timber Ridge, medical services, meal programs, social activities, transportation assistance, everything we needed when we were struggling. Everything this town's elderly population needs right now." The room was silent for a beat, then another. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice careful. "You understand what you're proposing. You're talking about giving away the vast majority of your fortune, over $100 million. We understand," Ruth said firmly. "We lived on Social Security for years. We can keep living on it. We don't need mansions or luxury cars or any of that. What we need is purpose. What we need is to know that our discovery meant something beyond making us rich." "But you could be comfortable," one of the authentication specialists said, clearly struggling to understand. "You could travel, help your children, enjoy your final years without financial stress." "We could," Harold agreed. "And we will. We're keeping enough to be comfortable, to help our kids when they need it, to finally take that road trip we've been planning. But the rest," he gestured broadly, "the rest doesn't belong to us. Not really. Edgar Finch gave it to Chance. Chance gave it to us. And now we're giving it where it's needed most." Dr. Castellano had tears in her eyes. "This is remarkably generous. Truly. Do you know how rare this is? Most people who come into sudden wealth, they keep it, they hoard it, they let it isolate them from their communities." "We don't want to be isolated," Ruth said softly. "We want to be connected. We want to matter, not because we're wealthy, but because we used wealth to make a difference." The meeting continued for 3 more hours, working out details, discussing timelines, planning the structure of the foundation and the museum donations. Marcus cautioned them repeatedly about tax implications, about estate planning, about protecting themselves legally. The financial advisor tried one last time to convince them to keep more for themselves, to at least establish trusts that would generate income. But Harold and Ruth remained firm in their decision. As the team was leaving, Dr. Castellano pulled them aside. "I've worked in the art world for 30 years," she said quietly. "I've seen collectors hoard masterpieces in private vaults. I've seen families fight over inheritances until they destroy relationships. I've seen wealth corrupt good people. But this," her voice broke slightly, "this is what art is supposed to do. Move people, inspire generosity, create meaning beyond monetary value. Thank you for understanding that." After everyone left, Harold and Ruth sat in their small living room, surrounded by the same old furniture, the same worn carpet, the same life they'd always lived. Except now it felt different, purposeful, meaningful. "We're really doing this," Ruth said, wonder in her voice. "We're really doing this," Harold confirmed. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, Ruth breathing softly beside him, and thought about the path that had led them here. He thought about growing up poor in rural Montana, the son of a ranch hand and a seamstress. He thought about meeting Ruth when they were barely more than kids, both of them working minimum wage jobs and dreaming of something better. He thought about their wedding, a simple ceremony in a small church, their honeymoon, a camping trip, because that's all they could afford. He thought about watching their children grow up in hand-me-down clothes, eating generic brand cereal, never complaining because they didn't know they were poor. Kids are resilient that way. Sarah, Michael, and Jennifer had turned out well despite their humble beginnings. Or maybe because of them. They'd learned the value of hard work, of making do, of finding joy in simple things. He thought about the year he'd been laid off from the construction company, 8 months of unemployment during the early 90s recession, watching their savings disappear, taking odd jobs, swallowing his pride to accept food assistance. He thought about Ruth working double shifts at the grocery store, coming home with aching feet and a tired smile, never once complaining, never once making him feel inadequate, even though he felt it constantly. He thought about their golden years, the retirement they'd imagined traveling, spending time with grandchildren, finally relaxing after decades of labor. Instead, they'd gotten a cold rental house, stretched meals, medication from Canada, and the slow, grinding poverty that came from fixed incomes that never quite stretched far enough. And he thought about Edgar Finch, alone in his house on the edge of town, surrounded by treasures he couldn't share, dying with no one to remember him, leaving his collection to chance because he had no better option. That loneliness, that isolation, that quiet desperation, Harold understood it now in a way he never had before. Poverty isolates. Wealth isolates. The only thing that connects us is choosing to connect, choosing to care, choosing to matter to each other. The foundation became their obsession in the best possible way. They met with architects and healthcare consultants. They researched successful community centers in other states. They talked to elderly residents of Timber Ridge about what they needed, what they dreamed of, what would actually improve their lives. Mrs. Henderson from the post office said she'd love a place to play cards with friends without feeling like she was imposing on someone's home. Walter Simmons's widow said she desperately needed help with transportation to medical appointments. A retired teacher named Dorothy Chen said she'd love to share her stories with young people, but had no venue to do it. Everyone had needs. Everyone had ideas. Everyone had been quietly struggling in ways Harold and Ruth recognized intimately. The painting auction took place in New York City in late May. Harold and Ruth didn't attend. They watched from their living room via live stream, holding hands, hardly breathing as the bidding escalated. Museums competed with private collectors. Phone bids came in from Europe and Asia. When the gavel finally fell, the price was $8,700,000, significantly more than the appraisal estimate. Ruth turned to Harold, eyes wide. "That's more than we imagined." "That's more than enough," he replied. "That's more than enough to build something that'll last." The bearer bonds. Once their ownership was legally confirmed through months of complex negotiations, proved even more valuable than initially estimated. Some had accumulated compound interest for over 70 years. Others represented shares in companies that had become parts of modern tech giants. The final verified total was $103 million. After taxes, legal fees, and keeping a modest reserve for themselves $3 million, which felt simultaneously huge and small. The Bennett Foundation would have an endowment of approximately $87 million. Properly managed, it could fund community services in perpetuity, long after Harold and Ruth were gone. They called their children to tell them about the decision. The conversations were emotional and complex. Sarah cried and said she was proud of them. Michael was quiet for a long time before saying, "I think you're doing the right thing, Dad. I really do." Jennifer asked if they were sure, really sure. They didn't want to keep more for themselves, but ultimately supported their choice. None of the children asked for money, which made Harold and Ruth proud. They'd raised kids who understood that purpose mattered more than wealth. Still, they set up modest trust funds for each of the grandchildren college funds, not lottery winnings. Enough to help, not enough to spoil. The news that Harold and Ruth were donating most of their fortune spread as quickly as the original discovery had. The media coverage shifted from lucky retirees to generous philanthropists. Some outlets praised their decision. Others questioned their judgment, publishing think pieces about whether it was foolish to give away generational wealth. Financial advisors appeared on cable news to criticize their lack of planning. Religious leaders praised their charitable hearts. He remembered his friend Walter Simmons, who died 2 years ago at 78. Alone in his apartment, dead for 3 days before anyone found him. Walter had been a carpenter, a good man, a hard worker. But his social security hadn't been enough. His savings had evaporated during medical emergencies, and he died alone because poverty isolates, because being old and poor means being invisible. "I don't want anyone else to live like we did," Harold said, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't want anyone else to choose between medicine and food. I don't want anyone else to die alone because they can't afford to matter." Ruth squeezed his hand. "Then let's make sure they don't." The next morning, they called Marcus Brennan and Dr. Castellano and asked them to come to Timber Ridge instead of making Harold and Ruth drive to Helena again. The team arrived that afternoon, clearly curious about this unscheduled meeting, probably worried that Harold and Ruth were having second thoughts or legal concerns. They met in Harold and Ruth's small living room. Expensive professionals in their suits and professional attire crowded into a space barely large enough for the old furniture. Harold served instant coffee in mismatched mugs. Ruth offered store-brand cookies on a chipped plate. The contrast between the setting and the wealth they were discussing felt surreal. "We've made a decision," Harold began, his voice steady despite his nerves, "about what to do with the collection." The room fell silent, everyone leaning forward. "We're donating 4 of the 5 paintings to museums," Ruth continued. "Institutions where they can be displayed, where the public can see them, where they'll be preserved and studied." Dr. Castellano's face lit up. "That's wonderful. Truly wonderful. Which museums were you thinking?" We'd like your guidance on that, Harold said. Places where they'll be appreciated, where Edgar Finch's collection will be honored, not just stored in some basement. And the fifth painting? Marcus asked. We'll auction it, Harold said. We need some liquidity for what we're planning next. He took a breath, glancing at Ruth, who nodded encouragingly. We're establishing a foundation, the Bennett Foundation for Elder Care. We'll use the proceeds from the painting auction and the bulk of the money from the bonds and certificates to create an endowment. The foundation will fund a community center here in Timber Ridge, medical services, meal programs, social activities, transportation assistance, everything we needed when we were struggling. Everything this town's elderly population needs right now. The room was silent for a beat. Then, another. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice careful. You understand what you're proposing. You're talking about giving away the vast majority of your fortune. Over $100 million. We understand, Ruth said firmly. We lived on Social Security for years. We can keep living on it. We don't need mansions or luxury cars or any of that. What we need is purpose. What we need is to know that our discovery meant something beyond making us rich. But you could be comfortable, one of the authentication specialists said, clearly struggling to understand. You could travel, help your children, enjoy your final years without financial stress. We could, Harold agreed. And we will. We're keeping enough to be comfortable, to help our kids when they need it, to finally take that road trip we've been planning. But the rest, he gestured broadly, the rest doesn't belong to us. Not really. Edgar Finch gave it to Chance. Chance gave it to us. And now we're giving it where it's needed most. Dr. Castellano had tears in her eyes. This is remarkably generous. Truly. Do you know how rare this is? Most people who come into sudden wealth, they keep it. They hoard it. They let it isolate them from their communities. We don't want to be isolated, Ruth said softly. We want to be connected. We want to matter, not because we're wealthy, but because we used wealth to make a difference. The meeting continued for 3 more hours, working out details, discussing timelines, planning the structure of the foundation and the museum donations. Marcus cautioned them repeatedly about tax implications, about estate planning, about protecting themselves legally. The financial advisor tried one last time to convince them to keep more for themselves, to at least establish trusts that would generate income. But Harold and Ruth remained firm in their decision. As the team was leaving, Dr. Castellano pulled them aside. I've worked in the art world for 30 years, she said quietly. I've seen collectors hoard masterpieces in private vaults. I've seen families fight over inheritances until they destroy relationships. I've seen wealth corrupt good people. But this, her voice broke slightly, this is what art is supposed to do. Move people. Inspire generosity. Create meaning beyond monetary value. Thank you for understanding that. After everyone left, Harold and Ruth sat in their small living room, surrounded by the same old furniture, the same worn carpet, the same life they'd always lived. Except now it felt different, purposeful, meaningful. We're really doing this, Ruth said, wonder in her voice. We Aredination has Manigal. We're really doing this. We're really doing this, Harold confirmed. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, Ruth breathing softly beside him, and thought about the path that had led them here. He thought about growing up poor in rural Montana, the son of a ranch hand and a seamstress. He thought about meeting Ruth when they were barely more than kids, both of them working minimum-wage jobs and dreaming of something better. He thought about their wedding, a simple ceremony in a small church, their honeymoon, a camping trip, because that's all they could afford. He thought about watching their children grow up in hand-me-down clothes, eating generic brand cereal, never complaining because they didn't know they were poor. Kids are resilient that way. Sarah, Michael, and Jennifer had turned out well despite their humble beginnings, or maybe because of them. They'd learned the value of hard work, of making do, of finding joy in simple things. He thought about the year he'd been laid off from the construction company, 8 months of unemployment during the early 90s recession, watching their savings disappear, taking odd jobs, swallowing his pride to accept food assistance. He thought about Ruth working double shifts at the grocery store, coming home with aching feet and a tired smile, never once complaining, never once making him feel inadequate, even though he felt it constantly. He thought about their golden years, the retirement they'd imagined, traveling, spending time with grandchildren, finally relaxing after decades of labor. Instead, they'd gotten a cold rental house, stretched meals, medication from Canada, and the slow, grinding poverty that came from fixed incomes that never quite stretched far enough. And he thought about Edgar Finch, alone in his house on the edge of town, surrounded by treasures he couldn't share, dying with no one to remember him, leaving his collection to chance because he had no better option. That loneliness, that isolation, that quiet desperation, Harold understood it now in a way he never had before. Poverty isolates. Wealth isolates. The only thing that connects us is choosing to connect, choosing to care, choosing to matter to each other. The foundation became their obsession in the best possible way. They met with architects and healthcare consultants. They researched successful community centers in other states. They talked to elderly residents of Timber Ridge about what they needed, what they dreamed of, what would actually improve their lives. Mrs. Henderson from the post office said she'd love a place to play cards with friends without feeling like she was imposing on someone's home. Walter Simmons's widow said she desperately needed help with transportation to medical appointments. A retired teacher named Dorothy Chen said she'd love to share her stories with young people but had no venue to do it. Everyone had needs. Everyone had ideas. Everyone had been quietly struggling in ways Harold and Ruth recognized intimately. The painting auction took place in New York City in late May. Harold and Ruth didn't attend. They watched from their living room via live stream, holding hands, hardly breathing, as the bidding escalated. Museums competed with private collectors. Phone bids came in from Europe and Asia. When the gavel finally fell, the price was $8,700,000, significantly more than the appraisal estimate. Ruth turned to Harold, eyes wide. "That's more than we imagined." "That's more than enough," he replied. "That's more than enough to build something that'll last." The bearer bonds, once their ownership was legally confirmed through months of complex negotiations, proved even more valuable than initially estimated. Some had accumulated compound interest for over 70 years. Others represented shares in companies that had become parts of modern tech giants. The final verified total was $103 million, after taxes, legal fees, and keeping a modest reserve for themselves $3 million, which felt simultaneously huge and small. The Bennett Foundation would have an endowment of approximately $87 million. Properly managed, it could fund community services in perpetuity. Long after Harold and Ruth were gone, they called their children to tell them about the decision. The conversations were emotional and complex. Sarah cried and said she was proud of them. Michael was quiet for a long time before saying, "I think you're doing the right thing, Dad." I really do. Jennifer asked if they were sure. Really sure. They didn't want to keep more for themselves, but ultimately supported their choice. None of the children asked for money, which made Harold and Ruth proud. They'd raised kids who understood that purpose mattered more than wealth. Still, they set up modest trust funds for each of the grandchildren college funds, not lottery winnings. Enough to help, not enough to spoil. The news that Harold and Ruth were donating most of their fortune spread as quickly as the original discovery had. The media coverage shifted from lucky retirees to generous philanthropists. Some outlets praised their decision. Others questioned their judgment, publishing think pieces about whether it was foolish to give away generational wealth. Financial advisors appeared on cable news to criticize their lack of planning. Religious leaders praised their charitable hearts. But in Timber Ridge, the reaction was more nuanced and more meaningful. At church, Pastor Williams publicly apologized for his sermon about wealth's corrupting influence. "I was wrong," he said from the pulpit. The Bennetts show us that wealth doesn't change character, it reveals it. And their character is beautiful. At Miller's General Store, people started treating them normally again, not with envy or suspicion, but with respect and gratitude. Maggie hugged Ruth and whispered, "Thank you for not leaving us behind." At Betty's diner, the whispered conspiracies stopped. The booth where accusations had been muttered became a place where people discussed what programs the community center should offer, what services were most needed. The foundation transformed Harold and Ruth's relationship too. For decades, financial stress had been a constant presence in their marriage, an invisible third party in every conversation, every decision, bills to pay, sacrifices to make, dreams to defer. Now that weight was lifted, not because they'd become wealthy, but because they'd found purpose beyond survival. They laughed more. They touched more. They stayed up late planning the community center, like newlyweds planning their first apartment. Ruth started keeping a journal of their journey, not for publication but for memory, wanting to remember how it felt to transform suffering into service. Harold started sleeping better. The anxiety that had plagued him for years, finally easing. He'd wake up not worried about rent or repairs or medical bills, but excited about foundation meetings, architectural plans, the tangible reality of building something that would outlast them. One evening in early June, they drove out to Edgar Finch's old property. It had been sold, the house demolished, a young family from Billings building a new home on the land. The construction crew had left for the day, and Harold and Ruth stood where the camper had once sat, where their lives had changed. "Do you think he knew?" Ruth asked quietly. "Edgar Finch. Do you think he knew what would happen?" Harold thought about it. "I think he hoped. I think that's why he didn't destroy the collection or donate it himself. He was waiting for someone who'd use it right, who'd understand what it meant. Do you think we're using it right? I think we're trying. That's all anyone can do." They stood there as the sun set. Two elderly people on land that had briefly held their fortune, now just dirt and timber again, temporary and impermanent. But what they'd built from that discovery, what they were creating that would last. The Bennett Community Center would serve generations. Edgar Finch's paintings would inspire millions. The foundation would keep working long after they were gone. By mid-July, ground was broken on the Bennett Community Center. The ceremony was small but meaningful, just townspeople, local officials, Dr. Castellano, who'd traveled from Helena to attend, and Marcus Brennan, who'd become more friend than lawyer through the months of working together. Harold gave a brief speech, uncomfortable with public speaking, but determined to say what needed saying. Ruthie and I aren't heroes. We're just two people who got incredibly lucky. We found something valuable, and we had a choice about what to do with it. We could have kept it all, lived in luxury, traveled the world. Maybe some people think we should have, but that didn't feel right to us. He paused, looking at the crowd, his neighbors, his community, people he'd struggled alongside for decades. This center isn't charity, it's justice. It's saying that being old doesn't mean being forgotten. It's saying that everyone deserves dignity and healthcare and community. Not because they earned it, or because they're lucky, but because they're human. Edgar Finch gave us a gift. Now we're passing it forward. Ruth stepped up beside him. We hope this center will be a place where people gather, where they're cared for, where they matter. Not because of what they have, but because of who they are. That's what we needed when we were struggling. That's what we're trying to build now. Number Vise. The crowd applauded, genuine and warm. The first shovel of earth was turned. Harold and Ruth held the shovel together, their hands overlapping, digging into Montana soil, building something that would outlast them both. That night, exhausted and happy, they returned to their rental house. They still hadn't bought a new place. Somehow it felt important to stay grounded, to remember where they'd come from, to not let comfort distance them from the struggle they were trying to address. They sat on their small porch, the same porch where they'd made the decision to give most of it away, watching stars emerge. "Do you have any regrets?" Harold asked. Ruth thought about it honestly. "Sometimes I imagine what we could have done with all that money, the places we could have seen, the comfort we could have bought. But then I think about Dorothy Chen teaching her stories to young people at the center, about Mrs. Henderson having a place to play cards, about Walter's widow getting rides to her doctor. And no regrets." "Me neither," Harold said. "For the first time in my life, I feel wealthy. Not because of what I have, but because of what I've been able to give." They sat in comfortable silence. Two people who'd spent their lives on the margins of society, who'd struggled and sacrificed and made do with less, who'd stumbled into an extraordinary discovery and chosen to transform it into extraordinary purpose. The frozen camper was gone, sold to a museum as part of the Edgar Finch exhibit that Dr. Castellano was curating. The paintings were on their way to galleries where millions would see them. The money was becoming something more meaningful than digits in an account. And Harold and Ruth, 73 and 71 now, were no longer just survivors. They were builders, creators, the architects of a legacy that would matter long after their names were forgotten. The Bennett Foundation would serve Timber Ridge for generations. The community center would provide dignity and care for thousands of elderly people. Edgar Finch's collection would inspire appreciation for art and history across the country. All because two desperate people had spent $400 on a frozen camper, and then made the hardest, most important choice of their lives: to pass their luck forward, to transform personal fortune into public good, to prove that even in old age, even after a lifetime of struggle, you could still matter, still build, still create meaning from chaos. The stars overhead seemed brighter than ever, infinite and eternal, witnessing two ordinary people doing something extraordinary, not by becoming wealthy, but by choosing to share wealth in ways that honored both their past struggles and their future hopes. Tomorrow, the foundation work would continue. Tomorrow, the building would rise. Tomorrow, lives would begin to change. But tonight, Harold and Ruth were simply themselves again, two people who'd loved each other through poverty and luck, through struggle and purpose. through 52 years of marriage that had led them, impossibly, to this moment of peace and meaning and quiet joy. 6 months later, on a crisp October morning when the Montana sky stretched endless and blue, the Bennett Community Center opened its doors for the first time. The building rose from what had once been an empty lot on the edge of Timber Ridge, 3 stories of warm brick and large windows, designed not to impress but to welcome. Wide doors accommodated wheelchairs and walkers. A covered entrance protected visitors from weather. Inside, natural light flooded common spaces painted in soft, calming colors. It was beautiful in its practicality, built to serve rather than to showcase wealth. Harold stood at the entrance in his best suit, the same one he'd worn to meet Dr. Castellano, though it fit better now after Ruth had finally convinced him to eat properly. Ruth stood beside him in a new dress, the first new clothing she'd bought in 5 years. Simple and elegant. They greeted people as they arrived, shaking hands, accepting hugs, feeling overwhelmed by the sea of familiar faces streaming through doors they'd helped create. The crowd was larger than Timber Ridge's population. People driving in from surrounding towns after reading about the center in newspapers and magazines. Local officials came, including the mayor and county commissioners. Dr. Castellano arrived from Helena with several members of her team. News crews set up cameras, though Harold had asked them to stay outside during the actual opening, to let this moment belong to the community rather than become a media event. But the people who mattered most were the elderly residents of Timber Ridge and the surrounding areas. Men and women who'd struggled as Harold and Ruth had struggled, who'd felt invisible and forgotten, who'd needed help but had nowhere to turn. Mrs. Henderson, from the post office, arrived in a wheelchair, pushed by her granddaughter. Dorothy Chen, the retired teacher, walked slowly with her cane, her eyes bright with anticipation. Margaret Simmons, Walter's widow, came with her daughter, both of them fighting tears before they even entered. Pastor William said a blessing, his voice carrying through the crowd gathered in the main hall. We dedicate this building not to wealth, but to worth, not to privilege, but to people. May everyone who enters here find dignity, care, community, and hope. May this center be a testament to what's possible when we choose compassion over comfort, when we choose service over selfishness. Harold and Ruth cut the ribbon together, their hands overlapping on the ceremonial scissors, flashbulbs popping despite their request for subtlety. The crowd surged forward, eager to explore, to see what had been built with Edgar Finch's hidden fortune and the Bennett's extraordinary choice. The medical clinic occupied the entire first floor's east wing. 3 examination rooms, all equipped with modern diagnostic equipment. A small pharmacy offering medications at cost, no markup, no profit motive. A dental suite. Ruth had insisted on this, remembering her own years of dental problems she couldn't afford to fix. The clinic would be staffed by 2 full-time nurses, a part-time doctor, and a dentist who'd relocated from Billings specifically to be part of this project. Mrs. Henderson wheeled herself through the clinic, touching everything with trembling hands, tears streaming down her weathered face. I haven't seen a doctor in 3 years, she whispered to Ruth. Couldn't afford it, couldn't get there even if I could afford it. And now, her voice broke, now there's this. The meal program occupied a bright cafeteria-style space with large windows overlooking the mountains. Hot lunch would be served every weekday, free to anyone over 65, regardless of income. No questions asked, no means testing, no shame attached, just food, nutrition, and the dignity of a shared meal. The kitchen gleamed with commercial equipment, staffed by 3 cooks, one of whom was Betty from the diner, who'd closed her struggling restaurant to take this steadier job. Margaret Simmons stood in the cafeteria and sobbed. Walter used to skip meals, she told Harold, gripping his arm. Toward the end, when money was tight, he'd say he wasn't hungry, but I knew. He was saving food for me. She looked around at the bright space, the sturdy tables, the promise of daily meals. If this had existed 2 years ago, my husband might still be alive. Harold's throat tightened. He'd known Walter, had worked construction with him decades ago. That's why we built it, he managed to say. So no one else has to make those choices. The social programs filled the second floor, a library with large print books and audiobooks, a computer lab with tech support for seniors learning to video chat with grandchildren, craft rooms, a small theater for movie screenings and performances, and a gymnasium designed for low-impact exercise classes. Each space had been carefully planned based on input from elderly residents about what they actually needed, not what wealthy donors assumed they needed. Dorothy Chen ran her hand along the bookshelves in the library, her expression one of wonder. I've been alone in my apartment for 8 years, she said to a reporter who'd followed her inside despite instructions to stay out. 8 years of watching television and talking to myself. And now I have this. A place to go, people to see, things to do. She turned to the camera, suddenly fierce. You want to know what wealth is? It's not money. It's having somewhere you belong. The third floor housed the Story Preservation Project, Ruth's special initiative. Comfortable recording studios where elderly residents could share their life stories with trained interviewers, creating oral histories that would be archived, transcribed, and made available to schools and researchers. The space also included meeting rooms where seniors could be paired with students for mentorship programs. Ruth gave a tour to a group of high school students who'd volunteered to be story collectors. Every person in this town has lived through history, she told them. They survived the Great Depression, fought in wars, raised families through economic upheaval, witnessed incredible change. Those stories matter. Those experiences have value. Your job is to help preserve them, to make sure no one's life gets forgotten. One student, a shy girl named Emma, raised her hand. Why is this so important to you, Mrs. Bennett? Ruth's eyes filled with tears. Because for years, I felt invisible. My husband and I worked our entire lives, struggled, sacrificed, and nobody cared. We were just old people on the margins. This center, she gestured around, it's saying that every life matters, that every story deserves to be heard, that being old doesn't mean being worthless. Throughout the morning, Harold and Ruth moved through the building, watching people explore, seeing faces light up with possibility and hope. The physical therapist's office, where people could get help with mobility issues and chronic pain. The social services office, where trained counselors would help navigate Medicare, Social Security, and other bureaucratic nightmares. The transportation program, with 2 vans and volunteer drivers ready to take people to medical appointments, grocery stores, or just out for drives when cabin fever set in. Every detail had been carefully considered. Every program designed to address real needs. Every space created with dignity and accessibility in mind. This wasn't charity dispensed from above. This was community care built from understanding, because Harold and Ruth had lived the struggles they were trying to address. By afternoon, the formal opening had evolved into an impromptu celebration. Someone had brought a guitar. Music filled the main hall. People who hadn't danced in years found themselves swaying to old songs. The cafeteria staff served coffee and cookies. Children ran through the hallways while grandparents watched with smiles. For a few hours, The building became exactly what it was meant to be: a living, breathing center of community life. Dr. Castellano found Harold and Ruth in a quiet corner, both of them exhausted but glowing. "Do you see what you've done?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "Do you understand the lives you've changed?" "One times I do. One times I do. Do you understand the lives you've changed?" "We see it," Ruth said softly. "We feel it. And it's—" she struggled for words. "It's better than we imagined." Harold nodded. "When we found that collection, we thought we'd won the lottery. But this watching Mrs. Henderson get her first medical exam in years, seeing Dorothy discover she's not alone anymore, knowing that people will eat regular meals and have places to go and friends to see, this is the real fortune." That evening, after the crowds had dispersed and the building had emptied, Harold and Ruth walked through the center alone. Their footsteps echoed on polished floors. Motion sensor lights flickered on as they moved through spaces that would soon pulse with daily life. They stopped in the main hall, where a bronze plaque had been mounted on the wall that morning. Ruth read it aloud, though they'd both memorized the words weeks ago. The Bennett Community Center, established through the generosity of Harold and Ruth Bennett, in honor of Edgar Finch, who believed that beauty and history should be preserved and shared. May all who enter here find dignity, care, and community. May we remember that true wealth is measured not in what we possess, but in how we serve. Harold pulled her close. "Do you think Edgar would approve?" "I think he'd be proud," Ruth replied. "I think this is exactly what he hoped for when he left that collection to chance." They stood in silence. Two people who'd lived 73 and 71 years respectively, who'd spent most of those years struggling, who'd stumbled into extraordinary fortune and made extraordinary choices. The building around them represented more than bricks and programs. It represented a philosophy, a values statement about what mattered in life. Over the following weeks and months, the center became the heartbeat of Timber Ridge. The medical clinic saw an average of 40 patients daily, catching health issues early, managing chronic conditions, preventing emergencies that would have sent people to expensive emergency rooms or worse. 3 cases of undiagnosed cancer were caught early enough for successful treatment. Dozens of people finally got dental care they'd deferred for years. Blood pressure medications were adjusted properly. Depression was identified and treated. The meal program served over 200 lunches weekly, becoming not just nutrition but social connection. People formed friendships over shared meals. Widows and widowers found companionship. Veterans connected with others who understood their experiences. The cafeteria buzzed with conversation, laughter, life. The social programs exceeded all projections. Dorothy Chen started a book club that met Tuesday mornings, growing from 5 members to 23 within 2 months. A painting class launched, led by a retired art teacher. Computer lessons helped 37 seniors learn to video chat with distant family. Exercise classes improved mobility and reduced falls. Movie nights became weekly traditions. The Story Preservation Project collected over 60 oral histories in the first 3 months. Students who'd signed up for volunteer hours found themselves captivated by the lives they were documenting. Emma, the shy student who'd asked Ruth about the project's importance, spent hours interviewing a 94-year-old woman who'd been a code breaker during World War II. The student wrote an essay that won a state competition and earned a college scholarship. "Before this project, I thought old people were boring," Emma admitted to Ruth during a volunteer appreciation event. "But now, I understand their living history. They have so much wisdom. I've learned more from these interviews than from any textbook." The transportation program logged over 3,000 miles in its first quarter. taking elderly residents to doctor appointments, grocery stores, the library in the next town, even scenic drives through the mountains. For many, these trips were their first time leaving their homes in months or years. Isolation decreased. Depression rates among elderly residents dropped by 47%, according to a county health study. The ripple effects extended beyond the building itself. Small businesses in Timber Ridge began to recover. The diner saw increased traffic as people stayed downtown after visiting the center. The hardware store hired additional staff. Young families started moving to town, attracted by the community spirit and the knowledge that their own parents would be cared for as they aged. The population, which had been declining for decades, stabilized and then began to grow. National media picked up the story repeatedly. How one couple's discovery transformed a town. Montana's miracle, from frozen camper to thriving community center. The Bennett Foundation, a new model for elder care. Harold and Ruth gave a few interviews, always uncomfortable with the attention, always redirecting praise to Edgar Finch, to Dr. Castellano's team, to the community that had embraced the center. But despite the attention, despite the transformation they'd catalyzed, Harold and Ruth's personal life remained remarkably unchanged. They still lived in their rental house, though they'd finally agreed to let the landlord make some repairs: new windows, better insulation, a furnace that actually worked. They still drove the old Buick. They still shopped at Miller's General Store, still checked prices, still turned off lights to save electricity. "Don't you want to upgrade?" their daughter Sarah asked during a visit. "Buy a nice house, get a new car. You can afford it now." Ruth shook her head. "This house is enough. The car runs. Why would we need more?" "Because you sacrificed your whole lives. You deserve comfort." Harold smiled. "We are comfortable, sweetheart. We have heat in winter. We have food. We have each other and a purpose. That's comfortable." Their children had struggled to understand the decision to give away most of the fortune. But watching their parents over the months since the center opened, seeing the light in their eyes, the energy in their steps, the joy in their purpose, understanding grew. Their parents hadn't given away wealth. They'd invested it in meaning, and the returns were exponential. One evening in late December, as the first serious snow of winter began to fall, Harold and Ruth sat in their small living room. A fire crackled in their old fireplace. Christmas decorations, the same ones they'd used for 30 years, hung on a modest tree. They were looking through a photo album Ruth had been creating, documenting the center's first months. Pictures of Mrs. Henderson smiling in the dental chair after getting her teeth fixed. Dorothy Chen surrounded by her book club members. Margaret Simmons volunteering in the cafeteria, serving meals in her husband's memory. Children and elderly residents reading together during an intergenerational program. Veterans sharing stories during a support group. 100 small moments of connection, dignity, and care. "We did this," Ruth whispered, her voice full of wonder. "All of this came from a $400 camper. We have a blanged Trekkertile. We have a blanged." "No," Harold corrected gently. "All of this came from choosing to share what we found instead of hoarding it. The camper was just the beginning. The choice was what mattered." Ruth looked up at him. "Do you ever wonder what life would have been like if we'd kept it all? If we'd bought a mansion and traveled the world?" Harold thought about it honestly. "Sometimes, late at night, I imagine what it would be like to never worry about money, to have luxury and comfort. But then I think about Mrs. Henderson crying when she got her teeth fixed. I think about Dorothy telling me she's not lonely anymore. I think about Margaret honoring Walter by feeding people who are hungry. And I know in my bones that we made the right choice. Me too, Ruth said. Every time I walk through that building, every time I see someone's face light up because they matter again, I know we did what Edgar Finch hoped someone would do. We made his collection mean something. In January, Dr. Castellano visited with news. The paintings Harold and Ruth had donated to museums were generating unprecedented interest. Attendance at the Smithsonian's American Art Wing had increased by 30% since their acquisition was announced. A traveling exhibition was being planned, showcasing the entire Edgar Finch collection and telling the story of its discovery and eventual donation. The exhibition would tour 12 cities over 2 years, introducing millions of people to artwork that had been hidden for decades. Edgar Finch's name will be remembered, Dr. Castellano said, not as a recluse who hoarded art, but as a collector who preserved beauty until it could be shared. And your names will be remembered too, as the people who understood what he was trying to do. We don't need to be remembered, Harold said. The center is the legacy. The lives changed are what matters, but recognition came anyway. Awards they didn't want. Honorary degrees they felt uncomfortable accepting. Speaking invitations they mostly declined. The attention was exhausting and felt undeserved. They just made a choice. The choice that felt right. Why did that merit celebration? One invitation they did accept. The Smithsonian asked them to attend the opening of the Edgar Finch exhibition. It would be their first trip outside Montana since discovering the collection, their first real adventure since buying the frozen camper. They flew to Washington, Harold's first time on an airplane at 73, and stood in the crowded gallery, surrounded by the paintings they'd found wrapped in cloth under a camper floor. The paintings glowed under museum lighting, their colors rich and vibrant, their significance evident in the crowds that gathered to study them. A young woman stood transfixed before the landscape painting, the first one they'd authenticated. She didn't know Harold and Ruth were standing nearby. "It's beautiful," she breathed to her companion. "To think it was hidden for so long, and now we get to see it. Someone made the choice to share this instead of keeping it private. That's the real gift." Ruth squeezed Harold's hand. "That's what matters," she whispered. "Not our names on a plaque. That moment, right there. That girl, understanding that beauty should be shared." They spent 3 days in Washington, visiting museums, walking the mall, feeling overwhelmed by crowds and noise and the sheer scale of the city. By the 3rd day, they were homesick for Montana's open spaces and quiet. "I'm ready to go home," Ruth admitted. "Me too," Harold agreed. "All of this is impressive, but it's not us." The flight home felt like returning to themselves. Montana appeared below them, vast and familiar, the mountains like old friends. Timber Ridge looked tiny from the air, insignificant, easy to overlook, but they knew better now. Small towns mattered. Small choices mattered. Small acts of generosity could ripple outward in ways you'd never anticipate. Spring arrived in Montana with its usual dramatic transformation. Snow melted, revealing brown earth that would soon green. Harold and Ruth, now 74 and 72, stood in their backyard looking at the spot where the frozen camper had once sat. It felt like a lifetime ago and yesterday simultaneously. "Remember when we first saw it?" Ruth asked. "Covered in snow, looking abandoned and impossible. I remember thinking we were crazy," Harold admitted. $400 we couldn't afford, buying something we didn't need, hoping for what? An adventure we were probably too old for. We were never too old, Ruth said firmly. "We just needed the right vehicle." End quote. "We were never too old." End quote. Which brought them to their announcement. At the 1-year anniversary celebration of the Bennett Community Center, in front of the entire town and several news crews, Harold and Ruth revealed their next plan. "We've spent the past year building something for others," Harold began, his voice carrying through the packed main hall. "And that work will continue. The foundation is strong, the programs are thriving, and this center will serve Timber Ridge for generations." But he smiled at Ruth. "We never did take that road trip we've been planning for 50 years, Ruth continued. "We bought a camper. A good one this time, new and reliable. We're going to spend the summer driving around this country we've lived in our whole lives but barely seen. We're going to visit our children and grandchildren. We're going to see the ocean. We're going to finally take the adventure we've been postponing our entire lives." The crowd erupted in applause. People cheered. Someone shouted, "You've earned it!" Pastor Williams was crying openly. Harold raised his hand for quiet. "Here's the thing, though. We're not running away from Timber Ridge or abandoning the foundation. We're taking an adventure because we learned something important this past year. Life is short. Time is precious. And you can't keep postponing joy, postponing adventure, postponing living, because someday runs out faster than you think." Ruth's voice was thick with emotion. "We spent our whole lives being responsible, being practical, putting off what we wanted for what we needed. And we don't regret that. We raised good kids. We worked hard. We survived. But now, we have a chance to actually live, not just survive, and we're taking it." The applause this time was deafening. Mrs. Henderson was on her feet, literally on her feet. Not in her wheelchair. Her mobility improved through the center's physical therapy program. Dorothy Chen was clapping so hard her hands must have hurt. Margaret Simmons was crying and smiling simultaneously. The entire community, the community they'd transformed, was celebrating their choice to finally prioritize themselves. 2 weeks later, on a brilliant May morning, Harold and Ruth loaded their new camper, a modest 24-foot model, comfortable but not extravagant, with everything they needed for 3 months on the road. Clothes, books, maps. Ruth still preferred paper, maps to GPS, photographs of their grandchildren, and one item from the frozen camper, the letter from Edgar Finch, carefully preserved in a plastic sleeve. Their children came to see them off. Sarah, Michael, and Jennifer with their spouses and children. A crowd of family gathered in the driveway. Grandchildren climbed through the camper, excited and envious. "You're going on an adventure," 7-year-old Emma squealed. "We are," Ruth confirmed, kneeling to hug her. "The adventure we should have taken 40 years ago. Why didn't you?" Emma asked, with a child's directness. Ruth thought about it. "Because life got in the way. Because we were busy surviving. Because we thought adventure was something for other people. People with money and time and luck." She smiled. "But we learned that adventure is for anyone brave enough to take it." Harold finished the walk-around inspection of the camper, checking tire pressure and connections with the thoroughness of someone who'd learned the hard way that preparation matters. The camper was nothing like the frozen wreck they'd bought for $400. This one had working appliances, functioning heat and air conditioning, a bathroom that actually worked, beds with real mattresses. It represented everything they dreamed about and more. But as he walked past it, Harold found himself thinking about that old frozen camper with unexpected fondness. That broken-down wreck had contained more than art and bonds. It had contained possibility, purpose, a chance to matter in ways they'd never imagined. In some ways, it had saved their lives not from poverty, though it had certainly ended their financial struggles, but from insignificance, from the quiet desperation of feeling invisible and forgotten in their old age. The neighborhood gathered to see them off. Maggie from Miller's brought cookies for the road. Dennis Cooper checked the hitch one more time, though Harold had already checked it twice. Pastor Williams said a blessing. The mayor presented them with a proclamation declaring it Harold and Ruth Bennett Day in Timber Ridge, which embarrassed them both but also touched them deeply. "You changed this town," the mayor said simply. "You showed us what's possible when people choose generosity over greed. This day is the least we can do to say thank you." Finally, it was time to leave. Harold climbed into the driver's seat. Ruth settled into the passenger seat with her maps and planning notebooks. The engine started smoothly, such a different sound from their old Buick, which they donated to the transportation program. This was happening. After 52 years of marriage, decades of struggle, one extraordinary discovery, and a year of building something meaningful, they were finally taking their adventure. Harold looked at Ruth. "Ready?" She smiled. The same smile he'd fallen in love with when they were both young and poor, and full of dreams. "I've been ready for 50 years. Let's go." They pulled out of the driveway to waves and cheers. The camper rolled smoothly down Maple Street, past their rental house where they'd struggled for so long, past the community center that bore their name, past Miller's and Betty's, and the post office, and all the familiar landmarks of a life lived small. At the edge of town, Harold pulled over one last time. They sat there for a moment, looking back at Timber Ridge, the town they'd transformed without meaning to, simply by making one choice after another that felt right. "Do you think we'll come back?" Ruth asked. "Of course we'll come back. This is home. This is where we matter." Harold took her hand. "But for now, let's see what else is out there." They drove west toward the mountains, then south toward Yellowstone, their first destination. The road unfurled before them, ribbons of asphalt through spectacular landscape. They drove slowly, in no hurry, stopping whenever something looked interesting. A roadside diner where the coffee was terrible but the pie was perfect. A small museum celebrating local mining history. A scenic overlook where they stood holding hands, looking at mountains that had witnessed centuries of human struggle and triumph and change. In Yellowstone, they watched Old Faithful erupt, tourists crowding around with cameras and phones. They hiked easy trails, their steps slower than the young families around them, but steady. They ate sandwiches at a picnic table and watched elk graze in the distance, both of them overwhelmed by the simple joy of being somewhere new, of doing something they'd dreamed about their entire lives. From Yellowstone, they drove to Colorado to visit Michael and his family. 5 days of grandchildren, and noise, and laughter. Then to Kansas to see Ruth's cousin she hadn't seen in 20 years. Then to St. Louis, because Ruth wanted to see the Gateway Arch. Then to Kentucky, because the countryside looked beautiful, and they had no schedule to keep. Everywhere they went, people recognized them. The story of the frozen camper fortune had become something of a legend, repeated and embellished with each retelling. "Are you those people?" a waitress in Tennessee asked. "The ones who found the paintings and gave it all away." "We didn't give it all away," Harold corrected gently. "We used it. There's a difference. We won. After Strond, we won gently." The waitress shook her head in wonder. "Most people would have kept it, bought mansions and fancy cars." Ruth smiled. We tried to imagine that life. It felt empty, using the money to help others, building something meaningful that felt full. They drove to the Atlantic Ocean, fulfilling Ruth's childhood dream of feeling sand under her feet and watching waves crash against shore. They stood at the edge of the continent, toes in surf, holding hands like newlyweds. "We made it," Ruth whispered, tears streaming down her face. "After all these years, all the struggles, all the times we thought we'd never see anything beyond Montana, we made it." Harold pulled her close, both of them buffeted by ocean wind, tasting salt air, feeling the spray on their faces. "We made it," he confirmed. They worked their way up the coast, visiting Sarah and her family in Seattle. 2 weeks of coffee shops and Pike Place Market, and watching the grandkids perform in a school play. Sarah confessed she'd been skeptical about their decision to donate most of the fortune. "I thought you were being reckless, giving away security. But seeing you now, seeing how you light up when you talk about the center, about the people you've helped, I was wrong. You found something more valuable than money. We found purpose," Ruth said simply. "We found meaning. And we found it by giving away what we thought we wanted, and discovering what we actually needed." By late July, 3 months into their journey, they'd driven over 8,000 miles. They'd seen forests and deserts and mountains and oceans. They'd visited children and grandchildren, old friends and new places. They'd eaten in diners and slept in campgrounds and watched sunsets from a dozen different states. They'd laughed more in 3 months than they had in the previous 10 years. But they were ready to go home. Montana called to them, the wide sky and open spaces, and the community they'd helped transform. In early August, they turned the camper north and east, retracing their path with the satisfied exhaustion of people who'd accomplished something important. As they crossed back into Montana, both of them felt it, that sense of coming home, of returning to themselves. The mountains appeared on the horizon, familiar and welcoming. "I never want to leave this state again," Ruth said, only half joking. "Me neither," Harold agreed. 3 months was perfect. "Now I want to be home." They pulled into Timber Ridge on a Thursday afternoon. News of their return had spread, and people lined Main Street waving welcome home signs. The community center had hung a banner, "Welcome home, Harold and Ruth." Mrs. Henderson stood on the sidewalk without her wheelchair, waving with both hands. Dorothy Chen held a sign that said, "Our heroes are back." Margaret Simmons cried openly. So happy to see them she couldn't speak. They drove slowly through town, waving, laughing, feeling the love of a community they'd saved by choosing service over selfishness. At their rental house, they unpacked the camper, carrying in souvenirs and dirty laundry and thousands of photographs, tangible proof of the adventure they'd finally taken. That evening, they walked to the community center. It was after hours, the building quiet and empty. They used Harold's key to enter, moving through spaces that now felt sacred. The medical clinic where lives were being saved. The cafeteria where loneliness was being defeated. The library where stories were being preserved. The gym where dignity was being restored through movement and health. They stopped in front of the bronze plaque in the main hall. Ruth read it again, the words even more meaningful after 3 months away. "May all who enter here find dignity, care, and community." "They are," Harold said softly, "because of Edgar Finch's collection and our choice to honor his wishes." Ruth turned to him, her eyes bright with tears and joy and satisfaction. "Do you know what I think?" Done. I. What? I think we didn't find a fortune in that frozen camper. We found our purpose. The money was just the tool. The purpose, helping others, building community, making sure no one else struggles like we did. That's the real treasure. Harold nodded slowly, feeling the truth of it settle in his bones. We spent our whole lives being poor. We thought money would solve everything. But it turns out, money just gives you choices. The choice is what matters. They stood together in the building they'd created. Two people who'd lived ordinary lives until extraordinary circumstances gave them a chance to become extraordinary. The paintings from the frozen camper now hung in museums across America, inspiring millions. The bonds and certificates had funded a community center that would serve Timber Ridge for generations. Edgar Finch's lonely, careful preservation had become public good. And Harold and Ruth, 74 and 72 years old, had discovered that wealth wasn't measured in bank accounts or possessions. It was measured in lives touched, in community transformed, in purpose discovered and fulfilled. They'd bought a frozen camper for $400, found $156 million hidden inside, and learned that the real fortune was neither the price they paid nor the money they found, but the choice they made to pass their luck forward. "Should we go home?" Ruth asked. "In a minute," Harold said. He pulled her close. Both of them, standing in the empty hall of the center that bore their name, the building that would outlast them, the legacy that would matter long after they were gone. "I just want to stand here for a moment. I want to remember what this feels like." "What does it feel like?" "Like we finally got rich," he said. "Not in our bank account, but in our souls." They stood together in comfortable silence. Two people who'd survived poverty and discovered wealth, and learned that the distance between the two had nothing to do with money. It was about purpose, about service, about choosing to matter in ways that transcended personal comfort. Outside, the Montana sky darkened toward evening. Stars beginning to emerge. Inside, motion sensor lights flickered off one by one, leaving Harold and Ruth in gentle darkness, still holding each other, still standing in the center of their legacy. Tomorrow, the building would fill with people again. Lives would be changed. Loneliness would be defeated. Dignity would be restored. The work would continue, the impact rippling outward in ways they'd never fully know, touching lives they'd never meet, inspiring choices they'd never witness. But tonight, they were simply Harold and Ruth Bennett, two people who'd made a $400 gamble on a frozen camper and discovered that sometimes the greatest adventures of our lives begin not when we're young and fearless, but when we're old and brave enough to believe we still have something to offer, something to build, something to give. Because in the end, anyone can find treasure if they're willing to look beneath the surface. But it takes wisdom to recognize that true wealth isn't what you discover, it's what you do with it once it's found. And it takes courage to choose meaning over money, purpose over possessions, service over selfishness. Harold and Ruth had found that wisdom. They'd summoned that courage, and in doing so, they'd transformed not just their own lives, but an entire community, proving that it's never too late to matter, never too late to build, never too late to create something that outlasts you. The frozen camper was long gone, sold to a museum as part of Edgar Finch's exhibit. But its legacy remained in paintings hanging in galleries, in bonds transformed into community care, in two elderly people who'd chosen extraordinarily well when given an extraordinary chance. They'd bought a dream for $400. They'd found a fortune worth millions, but what they'd actually discovered, what they'd actually created, was something far more valuable than either. A purpose that would echo through generations. A legacy of generosity, and proof that ordinary people, given the right circumstances and the courage to choose wisely, could do extraordinary things. Not by keeping wealth, but by sharing it. Not by hoarding fortune, but by transforming it into meaning. Not by asking, "How much can we get?" but by answering, "How much good can we do?" That was the real treasure hidden in the frozen camper. That was the fortune worth more than $215 million. That was the legacy of Harold and Ruth Bennett. Not the money they found, but the choice they made, the lives they touched, the community they transformed, and the reminder that sometimes the greatest wealth we can possess is the wisdom to give it away. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories of hope, heart, and second chances. Click to continue the journey with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe it's never too late to make a difference.